This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Right now, Renegade University is adding courses to its catalog almost every day. We have new webinars that are being offered soon and several video courses that you can purchase right now. But this week, we have Scott Horton teaching another webinar. On Wednesday night, Scott will be teaching the history of the War on Terror. He will make the argument that the War on Terror has been the greatest human catastrophe of our time, but also that the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations are primarily responsible for it. Scott will make the best possible case for that, but then let you decide. It's a live webinar with both lecture and discussion sections. So Scott's webinar is The War on Terror, a Global Catastrophe. That's this Wednesday, February 7th, 5:30 p.m. Pacific Time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. You can go to thaddeusrussell.com/courses for more information and to register. When I interviewed Dave Smith last summer, I told him that I would put him up in a debate against any academic, against any public policy expert on nearly any major political question, and I would bet on him. I'd bet a lot of money on him, I said. And then about 2 weeks ago, I saw Dave on a cable news show, and they were debating whether or not the United States should intervene in Syria again. He was on a panel with 4 or 5 foreign policy so-called experts, people from think tanks, from academia. And Dave delivered the most perfectly crafted analysis of U.S. foreign policy in the last 30 years that I have ever seen on any cable news show or anywhere in the media for that matter. I have to say, I just felt tremendous pride, but also just honor in knowing him. And I also knew I had to have him back on the show. So last week when I was in New York City, I sat down with Dave, right across the street from the United States Federal Building. This is my interview with Dave Smith. So I'm sitting with Dave Smith right across from Dave's favorite building in New York City, the Federal Building, Federal Plaza. It's where the U.S. government does its business in New York City. And I assume just regularly, I mean, you're busy, so it couldn't be every day, but, on a regular basis, because you're a good American, you go and you pray to it, don't you?
Of course.
You kneel down and
submit another job application.
Give your thanks for the protection that the federal government gives you and all the goodness that it shares with the people, right?
Yeah, it's all right here in the Federal Reserve Building, and they're all right in this area.
It's quite something. Do you have feelings when you walk by those buildings? I do.
Yeah. Oh no, I absolutely do. The Federal Reserve one particularly, where I'm like, you bastards.
I love you libertarians and your Fed obsession. I mean, I basically probably agree with you on the Fed, and I probably should feel more passionate. I need to learn more, but it doesn't quite get me the way it does you guys. But no, I think and also if you look at the architecture of them, I was noticing this walking around this neighborhood, that it's just, they're so imposing. All the buildings, all the federal buildings and the state buildings here, so imposing. I mean, they're intimidating when you stand underneath them. They're scary. Yeah,
it's the statism is just a religion.
It's not an accident that the architecture is that way, I think.
Yeah, well, it's the same as like a church that has its stained glass windows and everything. You can't just have like a few chairs pulled around and someone goes, hey, let's talk about Jesus. You got to have like an organ and like the stained glass, and everyone's like, oh, Jesus. It's always got to be this big production.
And they're announcing, we are bigger than you and above you.
Yeah, that's right. Submit.
You cannot breach these walls. Nor should you. Nor should you try. Yeah, no, I do think about architecture a lot. I've written, a lot of people know that I've written about how I felt when I first walked on the Columbia campus and saw the columns, which are, the Roman columns that are on the main building at Columbia Law Library. And thinking, God damn, that's intentional, man. They make me feel small. I think that's really what the intention is.
And I just think there's a striking similarity between that and religion. I mean, I remember being at my sister's college graduation, and it's just so strange. It's like they're all up there in these goofy sheets and gowns, and there's this big ceremony, and I thought you guys were academics. Like, what is this? What are we doing here? You're just convincing everyone of your kind of greatness and this, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know if it comes from the church. I mean, of course, it comes from antiquity. At least the Greek and Roman columns do, obviously.
Right.
But yeah, the cathedral, of course, right, was intended to announce constantly that God is above you and bigger, or we, the church, we're bigger and above you.
Right, God, right? And then, you know, you can't really talk to God, but you can talk to us, who's like his boy.
I mean, we're the reps.
Right.
We are bigger than you. But it really is, I think it really was intentional, and it certainly is now. Even in this modern age in New York City, you know, the buildings by the federal government in a supposed democracy announce that we are inferior. I really think it's something. People should look at those buildings when they walk by them and think about it. In Washington, D.C., you know, have you spent much time in D.C.?
No, not much. I've been there a couple times, but not a lot.
You've been there, right? You've been on the mall?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So first of all, it's hideous, okay? Second of all, the way it's planned, the buildings are spread apart a lot, right? And then they're just these imposing, based on their sort of neoclassical architecture. So it's sort of like Columbia, right? Greek or Roman, right? Deliberately designed to be imposing in that way. And do you know, Dave, because we talked about this last time, we talked about this general subject, but not this particular part of it, that style of architecture was copied by another country in the 1930s. And so that a lot of the buildings, the state buildings, government buildings in that country in the 1930s, very few of them remain because a lot of them were bombed. Hint, hint, hint. Yeah. So no, it was the Nazi government's policy to erect buildings of the neoclassical style that looked almost exactly like Washington D.C.'s buildings.
Very interesting.
And there's a piece in my book actually on this. I was originally going to have pictures of the buildings, but you can do it yourself. You can just go online, and if you Google it, Speer was the architect. There was one architect, the national architect who designed those buildings, I believe, had communications with German architects. They built Berlin and Washington, the new buildings in Washington, to look alike.
Well, isn't that comforting?
Yeah. Well, so there you go.
A couple days after National Holocaust Remembrance Day.
So we're not fans of the government, if people are wondering. And Dave has this special out, 1 hour. Oh, Dave's a comedian, if you don't know. I think most of you do, but he's a comedian, which is also unusual. First of all, it's unusual for political people of any kind to be funny.
Yeah, that is true.
Isn't that a trip? Like,
yeah. And today's political culture has actually pulled a lot of comedians out of funny into this world of like advocacy, which is like to me one of the saddest things ever.
What's the guy who replaced Jon Stewart? Noah
Colbert. Oh no, I'm sorry. Trevor Noah.
Trevor Noah. Yeah, he's incredibly unfunny.
Oh yeah, unfunny.
Unless I'm just being racist.
Well, you are, but it can still be true.
Am I right? He really is.
He's horrible.
Unfunny. Yeah, because even Jon Stewart, often I disagreed with him, right? But he was always funny.
He was funny, and he always, whether or not you agreed with Jon Stewart, obviously I didn't agree with him a lot of times also, but he kind of, you could tell there was like some depth there, and it was very funny, and you would tell he kind of had thought these things through. He had an opinion. Trevor Noah has like just a shallow understanding of the political scene and then is commenting on it all the time. And there's never anything very funny there.
It's actually embarrassing to watch.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think there's I'm sorry to say, but I think it's just virtue signaling, his hiring for that position, you know, and
no question.
And the fact that he still has it, I can't imagine the ratings are any good. I don't know what they are.
I mean, there's no question they're way down from Jon Stewart days.
Way down.
But no, it was when Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert, who were both just excellent, just hilarious comedians. Whether you agree with them or not, I think Colbert has gotten a lot less funny these days, but he was great on the Colbert Report. And there was a lot of complaining from people on the left that they were like, well, why is it just straight white men who do the liberal commentating? You know, like, shouldn't they be? And so they got Trevor Noah, and then to replace Colbert, they did this show that ended up being called The Nightly Show, but it was originally called The Minority Report when they were developing it with, what's his name? I'm blanking on his name.
Larry Wilmore.
Yeah, Larry Wilmore.
Right.
And
also very unfunny.
Yeah, and they were just both horrible. And they got like that show got canceled. Trevor Noah, they're still keeping around, but it really is an unbelievable thing where you're like, okay, yeah, it's like, look, do you really have to make an affirmative action hire to get funny black comedians?
I was going to say, right.
Like the best comedians
Exactly.
ever. There's like there's no lacking of black comedians who are just incredible. So it's like, who cares, man? Just give it to the funny people. There is never, even, I mean, in the history of stand-up comedy, particularly the modern history, like the best comics ever. I mean, nobody's looking at Dave Chappelle or Richard Pryor or any of these guys and going like, who's a really funny black comic?
That's right.
They're just the best comics.
Yeah.
So comedy has been dominated by Jews and blacks. There's no need to like force anything into that.
No doubt about it. Yeah, that raises, I hadn't thought of that. That's right. That's a very good point. So the country is full of hilarious black comedians. I mean, by anybody's standard, well, almost anyone's standard, any comedy fan standard, right? Yeah. There's dozens and dozens who are just hilarious. Right. So they happen to pick the two who are unfunny.
Yeah.
And well, I think this says a lot about many things, and one of them is that black comedy or black comedians tend not to be politically correct in particular ways, right? Yeah, and that's something that should be highlighted. We should be talking about this. It's like, hey, you're speaking for minorities in your minority report? Well, the fact is that most black comedians, at least, don't talk like you and don't think like you, apparently.
Yep. And the best comedians always, like, the best comedy is always kind of intertwined with truth. Like there's it doesn't really work unless there's that element to it. And this is why I think many big parts of the left have completely turned on Chappelle and Chris Rock, because these guys just go up there and they're funny first. So when I remember when Chris Rock was at the Oscars a couple years ago, and everyone was so upset because he went up there and just kind of ripped on the whole white Oscars thing, and it was so funny. But then there's all these lefties who are like, he used his platform to punch down and all this, and it's like, no, he's just hitting what's hilarious here. He did great bits on that thing, man. It was so funny.
Yeah, Chappelle was awesome. I haven't seen the brand new special. I saw the first new special, the one that was in LA. I thought it was mixed but interesting, and a lot of it was funny. But I've heard that the one in DC is really, really good.
I didn't really care for the latest two nearly as much. I love Dave Chappelle. I think he's the greatest. Yeah. But for him, I thought they were a little subpar. I still think For What It's Worth and Killing Him Softly are the two best comedy specials I've ever seen.
Yeah.
They're just incredible.
Oh, yeah. I went to college with his sister, Felicia Chappelle. And his father was a professor at my college, Antioch College. Oh, really? And Dave lives in Yellow Springs, Ohio.
I knew that. I didn't know his father was a professor.
That's where my college was a professor. That's where my college is, yeah. In Yellow Springs, and he lives on a farm outside of Yellow Springs, and he hangs out. Yeah, so the Chappelles have been, sort of around my life for a while, but I never knew Dave. But no, let's see. I was going to say something else. What was it? Here's the difference between most black comedians like Chappelle, like Chris Rock, like Richard Pryor, and the black comedians who were hired by The Daily Show, which is that Chappelle and company don't really care about what white people think of them. And they're not seeking protection from white people.
Yeah.
They're not seeking inclusion. They're not seeking assimilation, that's for sure. They just don't really care too much about what white people think, Yeah. They do care whether white people pay them, which is only sensible. But I think that's the difference, because to me, the politics of Wilmore and Noah and, of course, liberalism generally is the politics of patronage. We're going to take care of these people who are vulnerable and oppressed historically and always will be. They are eternally oppressed. That's this new Ta-Nehisi Coates line that's basically dominant now among liberals, which is that racism is eternal and that there is no way to escape it, but we're just going to make sure that we all feel bad about it.
Right. Yeah, it's really horrible. And it's really, I think, so damaging to like young black kids. I mean, to like there's nothing worse.
Yeah, I don't think it is, actually, because they're not listening.
Well, I think it's bad.
It's kind of my point here, right?
Well, no, look, I think you're right. I think, a lot of black people who are like, say, in like black neighborhoods that aren't doing so great, they don't give a shit about that. They have other problems that are probably worse. But for like the black kids at like college universities who are listening to this stuff, I just couldn't think of a more damaging thing to tell a young person, that just basically, look, you're a victim. Everything that goes wrong is because of this big systemic racism, and you're up against it, and you can never overcome this thing. They're outwardly hostile to young white men on college campuses, but I actually think it's far worse the way they coddle women and people of color, as they call them.
Yeah, so when there was that explosion of protest on college campuses a couple of years ago about alleged racism and white supremacy on campuses, most of the vast majority of the allegations were obviously fantasy. Like at Oberlin, the Ku Klux Klan was supposedly on campus, and the cops are coming in, and our bodies are, endangered every single day. And it was just absolute fantasy, almost all of it, right? I've said this before, but just quickly, like it looked to me, and like a lot of people, like these kids are crazy. They need, and they were actually often calling for mental health care, and they needed, to me, mental health. Now, does that mean they're psychotic? No, I actually think that instead of just denouncing them as these crazy kids, we should think about why they might be crazy in that moment, in that place. And so if you think about it, they were put there for two reasons. One is to, quote, enrich the experience of the white kids.
Right.
That's the stated purpose of affirmative action, diversity, and to represent their race.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing because it really is like what these, so many of the values of today's like left-wing college culture, they are like upper middle class white values, but they want some brown and black faces around to have this diversity, but with their values. It's not like anyone's going into the hood and going, let's learn from you. We want some of your cultural values. They're sitting there and saying, no, we want these, like being offended by microaggressions is not a like value that you'll find in any other culture, but we want you here, and then we're going to push this on you. It's so fucking strange.
Yeah. So, well, first of all, the modern university, the modern college in America was created by whom, right? When, why, where? I mean, it was a white elitist institution from the get-go, and it wasn't until about 5 minutes ago that they started to let the inferior races in to make them feel better. Yeah, no, so it's a white institution originally, and it still is. Basically, they're still basically teaching the same things, the same ways of thinking, the same language, the same ways of talking as they always have. And so I think when people say this is a white supremacist institution, they're correct, just not in the ways they're talking about. The Klan is not there, but liberals, basically progressives, upper class, progressive white people who are patronizing toward blacks absolutely control that place. And it's the patronization. If you've spent much time on college campuses and you're aware at all, you've seen this, it's grotesque. It's one of the things I just could not stand. I've seen this happen again and again. Administrators, faculty just talk down like children, like they're children, to black faculty, even to black students. So here you are, you're a black kid, you're in this place, there's one or two other black kids in the classroom, somewhere inside of you why you're there. And it's really stated, right? To enrich the experience of the white kids and to represent your race. And then on top of that, you just receive this torrent of rhetoric from the professors about how racism has determined everything in American history and will continue to determine everything in American history, and how it's omnipresent, even when you can't see it or hear it, when you can't smell it, it's still there operating always. Yeah. And so how on earth could you not go crazy?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
I think this is just a credit to those kids who've been brought to those campuses in affirmative action who aren't crazy, who didn't lose their minds. And I've seen a lot of black college students over many, many years in those places. They weren't, I wouldn't call anyone crazy, but they were really disturbed, upset. It was very difficult for them to be there. And I understand it, just not for the reasons they were saying. The only thing is, the only language they have, the only way they have to think about racism is Jim Crow and Bull Connor and slavery. So that's why they talk about what's going on now in those terms, which makes no sense. Yeah. There's a different kind of, it's not quite racism, but it's real close. Right. It is operating, but it's not what they're talking about.
Yeah, and one of the things I really bugs me is that, because I am no fan of the cops in this country, and I think, the war on drugs is horrific, and there's so many just horrible policies that the cops for the whole militarization of the police, and it's awful. But then when Black Lives Matter comes out and gives these narratives like, oh, they're just gunning down unarmed black kids every day, and then they'll celebrate people like, what's the name? The kid in Ferguson?
Mike
Brown, where it's like, and they're like coming out with this narrative that they just want. It's like he was a gentle giant and hands up, don't shoot. And it's like, well, I'm watching him rob a guy on tape. So maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then it's like, it really discredits any movement that's like, hey, these cops are kind of out of control and they are an oppressive force. So that's really upsetting. It's really strange to me how college professors, how this thing spreads so much amongst them. Because you think these are supposed to be intellectuals, these are supposed to be people who are like, dispassionately looking at evidence. And I'll tell you, my sister's a college professor, and I've been at her.
I didn't know this.
Oh yeah, my sister's a professor of sociology.
She's wow.
Yeah, she's in the thick of it.
Where?
In Maryland.
Where?
University of Maryland.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So.
Oh my God.
But and I've been to her place, and she'll have like a bunch of college professors over, and there's this weird dynamic where like a few of them, they'll like come up to me, and it's almost like in a whisper, or they're like, hey, I actually kind of agree with you on a lot of stuff.
Really?
But it's like this, it's like, we're in my sister's living room. What are you whispering for? And it's weird to me where it's like even the ones who see that something is really wrong, whatever skill set it takes to be like a college professor, or whatever type of person is drawn into that, they're very smart people, but they're not the ones who are going to stand up against, like, they don't have kind of like whatever thing you have that drove you away from the college campuses. It's like they don't have that thing where it's like, well, I'm going to stand up and fight for this. The thing that Jordan Peterson kind of has,
Mm-hmm.
like they don't have that.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I noticed in faculty meetings, was that there would be like 10 of these people, the so-called SJWs, get up and give some presentation about white supremacy on campus and how the campus was a rape factory. And then the rest of the faculty, hundreds of professors, right, experts in social science, would just be quiet. They wouldn't say anything. So I saw, this small minority, right, sort of controlling the discourse. But mostly what I saw was cowardice, mass cowardice.
Right.
And then also, as you're saying about these people, like I did have many conversations with other faculty in which they would say, yeah, this is crazy. And blah, blah, blah. But you know what, though? It's actually, they're not just cowardly. They actually do agree with most of the fundamental assumptions there, right? So they believe that there's this thing that's white supremacy that's omnipresent, and that there's this patriarchy, and man, it's so bad. And when it comes to politics in particular, contemporary politics, I find that professors are just stupid often.
Yeah.
They'll be brilliant historians or brilliant political scientists, at least in what they do, and they can think very, very clearly and rigorously about these topics, that are either in the past or abstract. But when it comes to like today's news, they are as dumb as it gets. Here's an example. So there's a guy at Willamette University, where I'm sort of affiliated. I taught briefly there last year, who's basically the head of the history department there. Super smart guy, PhD from University of Wisconsin, several books, and a nice guy. I've talked to him a lot. He's been very open to certain ideas, and he's defended me actually against this insane social justice warrior professor there who attacked me for being a straight white male and stuff. And I'm thinking, well, this is a guy, there's hope. There's hope here. If there's someone like this in the academy, then maybe I do have a future here. Maybe there's a way to carve out some space in which I don't have to be insane. And just a few weeks ago, after that amazing New York Times article in which they basically claimed that Putin had taken control of the NRA.
It's just it's
the
a cartoon.
NRA,
yeah.
And that was why the NRA supported Trump. Not only that, but also religious right-wing organizations. Also, Putin was controlling them, and that's why they supported Trump too. That article,
that's right.
Which by the way has basically been, they've essentially, the author of that article has basically said recently, well, maybe none of it's true at all. And I'm like, yeah, no shit, dude, none of it's true. It was one of the craziest of all the crazy Russia stuff.
Which is all crazy.
So this professor tweets and says, after that article posts, says, it looks like Russia has deep influence in many of the institutions of the American right wing. And I'm like, you're an expert on American history, American politics. Because he teaches and writes about contemporary politics too. And you're one of the good guys. You're one of the more intelligent, sane, rational people I've met. And you bought this?
Yeah.
So I really, Dave, I don't know. So I think this hysteria about Russia is actually even more amazing than the election of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. I mean, there's one thing, not that this is exactly worked out in stone, but like, it's kind of funny to me how it's like the Democrats and leftists, they love to they get really angry about something after the problem's over. But when it existed, they were completely this, so like racism all of a sudden is a problem. But if you look at the Democratic Party's history during when there actually was systemic racism, like they're the worst of the worst, that now all of a sudden now Russia's a big threat. But like, it's like, but you guys were kind of apologizing for Stalin. And now but I'll tell you, nothing about the political climate like ceases to amaze me. The whole Trump election was incredible. Once they got this special investigation, once they got Mueller's investigation going on Trump, my thought was that like, well, this is going to go kind of like in a Ken Starr direction where they're not going to get anything on Russia, but they're going to find something. They'll get like some shady business deal. He's been a real estate developer for far too long. He's got something. What I think I agree with you on, what's crazier than any of that to me is that I think this investigation is actually blowing up in their faces. Oh, yeah. This is bringing the Democrats down. Oh, yeah. It's like government can't keep secrets anymore. It's coming out how insanely partisan this, and not even partisan, but like just how anti-Trump this whole thing was, and how they, the mainstream media just spent weeks mocking Trump for this idea that they were spying on him. Oh, you're so out of your mind. This is the most ridiculous thing ever. And they don't even have to like make a retraction. Like, well, I guess he was pretty much right about that.
Yeah, in terms of collusion with Russia and anti-democratic authoritarianism, as far as I know, pretty much all of the evidence that's been produced has been about the Democrats.
Yeah. It's really quite astounding. So, yeah. Is one of my favorite moments of the entire Trump presidency, I just loved this, was when Sean Hannity, when it came out, these like text messages or emails from the FBI got released where it was, a bunch of the guys on Mueller's team were the same people who were anti-Trump, pro-Hillary, and they were the guys who were advising Comey to not, go easy on Hillary Clinton. And Sean Hannity's conclusion that he draws from this is just so funny to me. Both sides of this are just amazing. So Sean Hannity's conclusion that he draws from this, he goes, for the first time in American history, the FBI has become politicized. And so this is Sean Hannity's conclusion that he reaches from this. He goes, now it's almost like we have a secret police in the fine tradition of this amazing organization. And now the left, you would think, has a perfect opening to say, well, actually, Mr. Hannity, the proud history of the FBI was like being run by a racist cross-dresser who was spying on civil rights leaders like this. But no. The left's response to Sean Hannity is, Sean Hannity has gone full Alex Jones. He's become a conspiracy theorist. It's like you guys are competing over who wins the retard Olympics right now. Like it's amazing. No offense to retarded people.
Yeah, so one of the major schools of thought in American historiography, which was developed by historians like Richard Hofstadter, you may have heard of, and others in the 1940s and 50s, which became sort of the dominant school of thought in American history for about a generation, was called the consensus school. So Hofstadter first argued in 1947, I think, in the American political tradition, that basically Americans have agreed on most of the major issues, most of the major political issues. And when he said Americans, of course, he wasn't thinking in racial terms because you weren't required to then, but he, of course, was really not just talking about white people. He was talking about political leaders. That's the problem with that book, is that he's really just talking about political leaders and sort of making them stand in for everybody. But in terms of the political class, there's no question that for both parties, right? And I think one of his lines in that book is, in their rhetoric, it sounds as if they're in war with each other all the time. It's this violent rhetoric, this overheated rhetoric. But when it comes down to it, the actual legislation, the votes on the legislation, and what they do as policy, it pretty much all looks alike.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Murray Rothbard wrote a lot about that, where he would talk about the old right versus the new right. And the old right he was kind of referring to was like the pre-World War II, kind of like Taft. And these guys who were really actually, they were anti-New Deal. They really wanted to, you could kind of call them true conservatives. They were like, no, we don't like the direction we've gone in since like Wilson, FDR, all this stuff. And they all got beat out by essentially what became the neocons. And it's all kind of, and Michael Malice made this point, but I think he's spot on, where he goes, at this point, conservatives are really like progressives maybe 15 years in the past. No one's like, oh, we should repeal entitlement programs. No one's actually saying we should go back. It's like, well, let's take off the last 5-10 years.
Yeah, that old right, they were called isolationists at the time, which was actually a slur invented by Admiral Mahan to discredit people who opposed the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines. They weren't isolationists because they were actually mostly for trade, even the so-called isolationist Congress people.
Right.
But they were, to my mind, heroically opposed to the war in Europe and against Japan, against World War II, what became known as World War II. And right up to the last minute. I mean, they sounded like Ron Paul on foreign policy.
Who also got that same insult hurled at him. They would also call him an isolationist, and he would always say, I'm a non-interventionist, not an isolationist.
Exactly.
And Ron Paul was completely for open trade. Ron Paul didn't have any of the protectionist stuff, and they still call him an isolationist.
Sure. So speaking of the FBI, guess what J. Edgar Hoover was doing with the isolationist Congress people?
I'd imagine spying on them.
He was surveilling them. He was opening their mail. He was setting them up for blackmail. He had agents following them. Ernest Lundeen, who was one of the major isolationist Congress, I think he was senator from Minnesota, right? I think that's right. Yeah. One of the major opponents of FDR's foreign policy, who was calling bullshit on FDR's lies all the time about how Germany was about to bomb us and Japan was going to invade us and all that stuff. He died in a plane crash, Ernest Lundeen, and on that plane were 2 agents from the FBI. And that's how we found out about this. And then it turned out that there was a whole network devoted just to discrediting the isolationists. And there were books written, by commercial presses, by, non-government officials, but they were clearly in league with the FBI to discredit the anti-war movement during that time, which, of course, it continued to do. The FBI continued to do during the Korean War, Cold War, and certainly the Vietnam War with COINTELPRO and all that. They were infiltrating anti-war groups the entire time. So that was one of the major purposes, actually, of the FBI since the beginning. Oh, and World War I, of course, they did the same thing. So that's been one of the major functions, intended functions of the FBI from the beginning, all the way through.
Yeah, I mean, even when it was first created, they're spying on anti-war activists, and then Woodrow Wilson's having them arrested. So I mean, right from the beginning, this is what they're doing.
But it was created actually originally for 2 purposes. 3 purposes. Well, 2 purposes. The first was to crack down on prostitution, which they called white slavery, and there was this whole myth about how these women were being kidnapped by Chinese men who gave them opium and then smuggled them off to some slave penitentiary in some underground fortress in San Francisco or something.
Even the way they put it sounds awesome.
Extensive fantasies,
Some Chinese guys got some opium.
That place exists. It's called kink.com. Which is an actual sort of Gothic style building in downtown San Francisco. I mean, it doesn't. It's where Kink, this porn company.
Okay.
And white slavery never happened in that building, but it looks like it, and they have dungeons in that building. But anyway, that was kind of the fantasy, except run by Chinese people. And occasionally blacks. But anyway, no, the FBI was actually created. It was called just the Bureau of Investigation, 1910, I think. Yeah. For that purpose, to lock up prostitutes. And then that became an anti-immigration campaign because they found out that a lot of prostitutes were coming from overseas to the United States. And so they ended up turning around a lot of people who might be promiscuous women, who might become prostitutes. And then they started, so it became anti-sex work, anti-immigration, and then the war starts, and then it becomes anti-war, and it's anti-war, protecting the war state for the next 100 or so years. So that's a pretty good left-wing organization that liberals should be supporting.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, it goes to show you that they don't actually give a shit about those issues. In fact, if anything, liberals have been leading the way on closing the borders, and I mean that, putting sex workers in prison, and inventing wars, thinking up wars. All the major wars were the inventions. I think I've told you this. The ideas came from the heads of Ivy League professors. Right.
Yeah. And all of the kind of democratic heroes who have become completely lionized were all war hawks. Like all of them. I mean, it's like to this day, like nobody, it's like Woodrow Wilson and FDR and LBJ, all these guys are heroes to them. And it's like, no, it doesn't seem to really bug anybody. So I first got really interested in politics in like the George W. Bush years. And I didn't know anything about this history. And it just seemed like in those days, it was like, well, there's a big anti-war movement over here on the left. And it was really, so when Obama came in, I was like shocked. But the more I've kind of learned about history, you're like, oh no, this actually all kind of fits together nicely. This isn't something new. This is they're kind of going right back to where they've always been.
What do you say about the presidents in your special? You said something about how they all should be thrown out of helicopters. every
Yes.
single one of them.
That's my nod to the alt-right in my special. I'll grant you that.
Except no, because they talked about throwing communists out of helicopters. You're talking
that.
about,
I'm not going that
you're
far.
talking about throwing John F. Kennedy out of a helicopter.
That I'm okay with. Let's dig him up and give him a one-way ride.
Oh man, the way that Kennedy is still lionized. When I came in to JFK last night, and there's those posters in JFK all over with JFK. John F. Kennedy with the sunglasses saying something very progressive and liberal or something. It's like, yeah, what was he doing right then in terms of Vietnam and Cuba?
Right.
And, I mean, that's
the guy who literally almost got us into a nuclear war.
And the nuclear buildup.
Yeah.
And he invented the Green Berets and, the special ops who are doing all this wonderful work for us now in the Middle East.
But I will say that I think it's in many ways a lot less damaging to like idealize some dead politician. Because it's kind of like, okay, you want to remember someone however you want to remember them. What they did with Obama while he was in office, while he's destroying Libya and bombing the crap out of these countries, to me is even creepier.
Well, no, but the past serves the present. In fact, in in those JFK posters at JFK Airport, there's an inset picture of Obama. Because
so I guess they're related, yeah.
Yeah, so JFK was progressive on race. First of all, bullshit. He was basically forced to intervene in the South on behalf of the civil rights movement. And why? There's a lot of historical literature on this, in fact. Mary Dudziak has written a major book on this, whose title I can't remember, but you can look it up, in which she argues pretty persuasively that the federal government was motivated primarily in helping the civil rights movement by the competition or rivalry with the Soviet Union in the third world. So, right, in the early 60s, you have the anti-colonial movement going on, right? All these African countries and Asian countries are throwing off their European oppressors. And the Soviets and the United States see a vacuum there, right? And so they're vying to get footholds in all these little countries all over the world, the so-called third world at the time. So there's a direct competition in almost every third world country right then. There's, always a sort of a pro-communist movement and a pro-American movement. And the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration knew this, and they said, well, it's really hard for us to like win over the peasants of Zimbabwe, if there's pictures on television of dogs eating black people in our streets. And so that's why we got to shut this down. We got to go down there and make sure that doesn't happen anymore. That's actually one of the reasons.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So again, man, it serves a war purpose.
And Stalin really used that, right? Like he had a lot of propaganda about
Stalin
how,
wasn't that stupid.
Yeah, I mean that it's
well,
kind
it wasn't
of funny.
Stalin. It was his successors. But yeah, I mean,
but like they really used to love to like let everyone know how bad America is to their black people. And this does. I always kind of wonder, because I don't exactly know how much of this is. I wonder with all this stuff on the left that we were talking about before, like how much is it people being useful idiots, and there's actually people up at the top who are like, oh no, this is kind of like a thought out plan to kind of divide the country and kind of create this narrative, because it does seem like, man, it's like no matter how much better America got on this issue of like racism, which is like just almost too broad of a term these days, but like no matter how much better we get, it's like the opposition gets louder and louder. Mm-hmm. It really is quite weird. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I know there was a lot of Soviet propaganda about this stuff.
Yeah. We did start with Stalin, but with Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they really ramped it up because they had all this evidence, right? Because that's when we had TV for the first time, and we had these images, these videos, this film of these black people in the South having dogs on them and fire hoses and all that. So it was a major part of the propaganda war between the two superpowers. So and this is, by the way, this is a fairly mainstream, even liberal position on why Kennedy and Johnson supported the civil rights movement with the federal government. It was for geopolitical purposes to win the Cold War. See, and more to the point here, and this is where the irony becomes amazing, right? To essentially take control of the third world, right? All those countries, those poor countries full of brown and black people, right? So they intervened in the civil rights on behalf of the civil rights movement here, so that they could essentially colonize all the brown and black people of the world.
Yeah.
Because look, you have your Peace Corps volunteers at the time, another invention of John F. Kennedy, right? And there's these idealistic college kids going to these third world hellholes trying to convince the locals there not just to dig toilets better, but to basically be in line with the United States, because there's going to be some commies running around those villages too. And so they could take with them, look what we did at home. We are in favor of universal equality and racial justice, and look the way we are now treating our black people better. And so that's the way we're going to treat you. So sign right here.
Yeah, that stuff is very interesting. Because there was an obvious, I always thought, JFK, like, what was it in like around the 1960 campaign where he went and like bailed Martin Luther King out of prison and stuff like that. And I thought it was like an obvious kind of like, oh, well, we're trying to get the black vote. Like that to me seemed like an obvious motivator for it. But this is really interesting. And I know I know that like a lot of people around Truman, right? They said that like dropping the bomb, the 2 nukes on Japan was much more about Russia than it was about Japan.
It was about message to Stalin.
Yeah, letting them know, hey, we have this bomb and we'll use it. So now let's negotiate like post-war stuff. And then I know like lots of people around JFK said that the whole space race had nothing to do with us exploring the universe or anything like that. It's like we have to beat the Soviets. So it is interesting that these things are always kind of thought on a geopolitical level. Like that's what the real goal is here.
And to serve a particular purpose, which was the expansion of the American empire.
Right.
So with the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we don't have much actual evidence of Truman thinking that way. We just don't have any evidence one way or the other what he was thinking. There's a little bit, but it's not enough to really hang an argument on. I mean, it's a good argument, but it's really theoretical and speculative, although it's intelligent. I think it's probable, but I can't say that it's definitive. But on the support of the civil rights movement and the space race, we have abundant evidence of Kennedy and all of his staff and Johnson's as well saying these things.
Right.
We're not going to be able to beat the Soviets in the third world unless we, clean up our own image for these dark people around the world who we want to be our subjects. Yeah. So, back to the Daily Show. That wasn't a good segue yeah. Although Trevor Noah comes from South Africa, I'm trying to figure out a way to segue here. I thought of it when you were talking about it, and I just didn't want to forget this. So, you and your special talk a lot about gender politics, and you kind of frame a lot of contemporary politics, around Trump and just what's going on generally nowadays around gender, which I think is apt. I think that there's a lot of expressions of gender politics that I think is really important on both sides or all sides. And when we were talking about the Daily Show, I was reminded of not my Me Too moment, but probably the only time, or at least it's the only time I can remember, where I saw a clear example of what is sexual harassment. Which was, I don't know, I guess I shouldn't name the guy, but he was a very, very, at the time, famous, prominent correspondent on The Daily Show.
Really?
Because I was on The Daily Show. This was a long time ago, 10, 15 years ago. Terrible experience. I spent 6 hours with this guy, him trying to get me to say something stupid, right? They were trying to make fun of me. And I knew what they were up to, so I just refused. But anyway, so I got to observe him. And we were in this room together, and there was producers, and then there was an intern also in that room who was, guess what, looked like about a 20-year-old young woman. And I remember he just, at one point, just randomly, there was no even no even introduction or anything. There was no sort of transition. He stopped talking to me and just stands up out of his seat and walks straight over to her and says, right in her face, he gets really close to her face, says, "Hey, you look really beautiful. Your eyes are so beautiful. Hey, you want to go out tonight? Can we have beer tonight? You're so beautiful." And he just starts talking right in front of me and all the producers about how beautiful, and she's very uncomfortable. They clearly aren't friends. And I think it was the first time they'd ever spoken to each other. And, he's got massive power and she has no power. And if she wants to get ahead at the Daily Show or in television or in entertainment, it's a problem for her, to blow him off, right? She may not ever get to work on his segments again, for instance.
Right.
I guess I shouldn't say his name, but
you're going to have to tell me afterward.
Oh yeah, but I don't think I want to do that. Yeah, because there is a small chance it wasn't what I thought, but boy, I'm as skeptical as anyone about these things.
Right.
But this was, to me, I was shocked. And right afterward, I told people, I said, man, you wouldn't believe what I saw happen. And I would imagine that happens. But you said that, you're saying that there's a lot. I agree with you that the vast majority of these complaints, just on the face of them, are simply not about harassment. sexual harassment, and certainly not sexual assault. At least the vast majority of Me Too complaints I've seen.
Oh yeah.
Right. But you went a little farther, and this is where you got even more dangerous, but I think even more correct, which was about Donald Trump and grab him by the pussy.
Oh yeah.
And sort of the masculine sexual aggressiveness, right? Do you want to say what your point was there?
Go check out the special for the joke of it. But I mean, more or less, my point was that everybody, there you had all these guys on the news. It was particularly the male journalists that just really bugged me. And it was I will never forget, but it was Jake Tapper who said he was on his show on CNN, and he said I was in a fraternity for all 4 years of college, and I always played sports. I've been in a lot of locker rooms, and I never heard men talk like that. And it's just like, man, you fucking liar. Like, you liar. Like, it's like, yeah, okay, to deny, really, I've never heard anything that nice in a locker room in my life. Like, that's the kindest thing. Mm-hmm. And then I just making the point that it's like, look, I mean, Donald Trump is this guy. Does anyone think Donald Trump pulls multiple models if he's not rich and famous? And I kind of alluded to, what's it called? 50 Shades of Grey. Yeah. And it's like, look, thumb through any romance novel, and who's the lead guy? It's always Trump. It's like some rich asshole who's grabbing women by the pussy. Like,
it's a good-looking Trump.
Right, sure.
And that's really important, right? In fact, a former guest on this show, Laura Kipnis, who's a feminist professor, has pointed out that men who are good-looking get away with this kind of behavior. It's almost always the unattractive guys who get called out for this.
Yeah, it's the Weinsteins.
Yeah, and it's probably because they're the ones who get rebuffed.
Right.
Whereas the good-looking guys tend not to. I mean, this is from her, and who knows? Even she doesn't know, right? No one knows, right? What goes on in all these, zillions of relationships out there. But that seems to me to be true, at least, given what most of these guys look like. I guess Matt Lauer's the exception, but Harvey Weinstein, and Al Franken, I mean, they're not going to get a lot of attention, sexual attention, right, from women. And so they kind of have to go seek it if they're going to get it. And
I think it's one of the things that drives these men to achieve so much and get so much wealth and power in these things is I think it's a pretty big motivating factor for most men in general is to get laid. Yeah. And so they get this power, and then this is like, well, this is why I got it. So let me go try to use this for what I wanted. But the thing that's a weird dynamic is that I think, it's like when these third wave feminist lefties will talk about, continuous consent in these things. Mm-hmm. And it's like, can I touch your boob? Now, can I touch your butt? Now, can I insert a finger? It's like nothing is less sexual. Nothing is more of a turnoff to the vast majority of women who are kind of looking for a decisive man. Like lots of women.
Yeah, that was the dangerous thing that you were talking about that I thought was actually really at the heart of this in some ways.
Yeah, lots of women want to be dominated sexually. Well, it's like, look at porn. Like, it's a pretty big theme. Yeah. Lots of men want to dominate and lots of women want to be dominated. I'm not saying it's all, but it's a shockingly large percentage.
You don't even have to look at porn. You don't even have to look at romance novels, although I think that's an outstanding point. If you look at romance novels, generally they are caddish, the men who are objects of attraction, at least, like Trump, essentially, but certainly aggressive sexually. Right. And they do things in those novels and in those films that would, according to the Me Too movement, absolutely constitute not just harassment, but probably assault.
Yeah.
Right. But those novels and films are consumed, just endlessly by women, and have been for more than a century, by the way. Those romance novels go back to the dime novels of the 19th century, and it was always the woman, this young woman who was working class or poor from the Lower East Side, who would sort of happen upon some wealthy, handsome gentleman on the street, who would then whisk her off to his castle and make passionate love to her. Right. And she would be reticent at first, and he would make all the advances, and she loved it, and then they ended up being married, etc. It's kind of the formula ever since, right? And 50 Shades of Grey, I've never read it or seen it, but I think isn't that more or less what goes on?
I believe
he's
so,
certainly
yeah.
the aggressor in ways that would not be acceptable to many of the Me Too movement people.
Absolutely.
Is that safe to say? I think so.
I'm pretty sure you're on safe ground there.
Yeah, well, and that's important. So the fact is that guy's super hot, right? And that's not insignificant here. I think imagine the 50 Shades of Grey guy looked like Harvey Weinstein, we would all think totally differently about if he did exactly the same things.
Yeah.
We would think totally differently about it.
Yeah, that's right. And look, you just got to say, I mean, that's just,
Now,
look, it's life, but it's very unfair, and it's not a fair standard to prosecute somebody over, or I don't mean prosecute in a legal sense, but just like it's not a fair standard. It's like women. Angela Lansbury made this point, and she got in some trouble for this, but she's just an older woman who doesn't give a shit at this point. But she said of the whole Me Too moment, she was like, and she prefaced it by saying like, look, there's never an excuse for a sexual assault, rape is a horrible crime, all that stuff. But she goes, like, women have to understand that women go through like incredible lengths to make themselves look attractive. And that is going to draw attention. And it doesn't always just draw attention from the guy that you want. Like if a woman walks down the street looking unbelievable, it's not just the good-looking, successful guy who she wants that sees that. It's also other guys. And you can't kind of blame them for like taking a shot. Now, I'm not saying like what Harvey Weinstein did is okay. But like, you know, like approaching a woman. Because according to the Economist.com did like these surveys, and I forget the exact numbers, but it was like 1 in 4 young women think that complimenting a woman on her physical appearance who you're not in a relationship with constitutes sexual harassment. 1 in 3 said that asking a woman out for a drink constitutes a sexual harassment. Wow. And it's like that stuff to me is where it just gets insane, like genuinely insane.
Well, then what are we supposed to do?
Well, that's it.
Just wait around.
Well, it's basically kind of like what you were getting at. It's that if she's into it, then it's fine. And if she's not into it, you're a creep.
No, but it comes down to waiting for her to initiate. Waiting for a woman. So you cannot. So initiation.
But initiating if she's into it seems to be fine too.
Oh yeah.
So it's kind of like, you know, it puts men in this impossible position.
So, but okay, isn't the Weinstein case at least a problem for libertarians on some level? Because of course he has no state power, right? He's not using state power to force these women to have sex with him, but he's certainly using his economic power,
right,
to do that, right? His place in that industry. You know, it was simply difficult to get ahead as an actress in the industry. Obviously, to get a position or a role in one of his movies, if you didn't fuck the guy. Now he knew that, and that's clear because you can hear him say that pretty much. You know, that is certainly coercion, wouldn't you say?
I wouldn't say. I mean, if you're talking in terms of like a legal definition, or is that technically aggressing against somebody? I would say no.
No,
I would say no. And I think the libertarian. I don't really see it as a problem for libertarians. I see like, okay, so the libertarian position is just kind of like, well, you can't throw them in a cage for that. I mean, that's like, you can't use force against somebody who didn't initiate force. So as creepy as it is to make a deal like that and say, to offer someone a deal, say, I'll put you in my movie if you blow me, and I'll ruin your career if you don't. I mean, no, I mean, even with all the laws we have today, the only thing that's going to solve that is to out him and then have a culture that would be like, okay, well, now we'll turn on him. So in that sense, I think the Me Too moment did a good thing with Harvey Weinstein. I mean, so I don't think it's coercion in a strict sense of like, he's not initiating force on anybody. He's not aggressing against them, but it is a creepy, shitty thing to do. And you hope to have a culture that's like, yeah, that sucks.
But he could do that only because of his wealth and his power.
Sure.
Real power, right? It's not state power, but it's real power.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. No question.
So how is it?
But I mean, there's lots of other things where, okay, so this came out about Louis, not the Me Too stuff, but they were. I was watching this documentary. It's on Netflix about the Dana Carvey show and their short-lived show, and they had like all these great comedians on there. But so Louis C.K. was the head writer, and Jimmy Fallon, a young Jimmy Fallon, auditioned for it, and basically Louis admits this. He basically just didn't like that he was a young, good-looking kid, and Louis, is like looks like Louis. And he was like, yeah, I don't want this young, good-looking kid who all the chicks are going to love in the audience. So he passed on it. And everybody else there was like really excited to have him work there. And Louis just put his foot down and was just like, no, I'm not going to he's not getting the job. And it's like, yeah, man, like it's fucked up. It's like a use of your power that's just fucked up, and you're kind of taking a career opportunity away from someone just for some completely unfair reason. And you couldn't do that unless you're the head writer on the show with this power. So like, it sucks. But there's no, like, it is and should be legal.
But wait a minute. So the market can take care of that if they don't have monopoly or near monopoly power, right? So if Louis is one of 100 or 200 or even 10 or 15 major comedians, or major people in the television industry, then the actress who gets proposed to by him, or basically blackmailed, can just go somewhere else, go to another comedian or another head of a studio, right? But in the case of Weinstein, and almost in the case of Louis C.K., they have virtual monopoly power, right? I mean, it's pretty close. And even in Weinstein's case, it's pretty close. I mean, because he doesn't just control his own studio. I mean, he's got sway with everybody in that town, right? So if you're an actress, 20-year-old actress, you gotta please that guy to get any job pretty much in Hollywood, I would think. But it's certainly possible that there could be an absolute monopoly, a straight up monopoly, in which case you cannot be in this profession unless you have sex with this guy. And then what do we say about that?
Again, I don't know that I have a solution, but the problem, the problem that I think with statism in general is you kind of come up with a problem of the market. And then it's like, okay, well, here's the problem. So obviously the solution is statism. But the state really only has one solution, which is they can throw you in jail. And so even in that scenario that you're laying out, I don't think throwing this guy in a cage, I think that's a worse moral violation than what he's guilty of doing. So like, I get your point, and that is a real thing. I mean, there's no question that people who have a lot of economic power will make propositions, not just in sexual situations, but like will make propositions that are pretty fucked up. But yeah, the only solution I really see for that is that you want more competition. You want somebody to not have a monopoly, hopefully, and then hopefully you would want these people to be like outed as the creeps that they are. But I don't know that works particularly well with or without state intervention.
So some people on the left are calling what Harvey Weinstein did rape. What do we call it? What do you want to call that?
Theoretically, because there is, in that tape that came out, the woman does say at one point, like, you grabbed my breast yesterday.
I don't mean that. I mean,
so if he did that, like, that would be a crime. We'd all agree
that's
on
different.
that.
I'm talking about the quid pro quo.
But just the
right. You sleep with me, I give you the part.
I would not call that rape. I'm sorry. I just think that and this is something that Marxists and people on the left do all the time, which really bugs me, is that they kind of call consensual relationships, even if they're like, I'll say this, like workers are slave labor, essentially. It's like, no, you have to draw kind of a line between somebody forcing somebody and somebody offering you a deal that might suck. So no, I'm not comfortable calling that rape. Rape is sex against someone's will. So I would call that being a really shitty person and being a creep.
So just so you know, I'm working through this myself. I don't have the answer. I just want to think through this with you right now.
Sure.
Because I think it's an interesting idea. I think it is fundamentally different than rape as we now define it legally, and I think it probably should be legally, but I don't know. I mean, so if you have a monopoly power in an industry, right, you can do this. You can say to people, if you don't have sex with me, you will never work in this industry. So they then, sure, have still a market choice. They can choose to work in a different industry, right? Have a different career, a different life, one that they didn't want, right? So that is not, to me, that doesn't rise to the level of holding a gun to someone's head.
Sure.
Right? And forcing them to have sex with you physically, right? Either through the use of force or the threat of force.
Right.
That's, okay, different. But still, this is something on a higher level, though, than just harassment, isn't it? It's coercion of a kind that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. Like, it's really wrong. Morally speaking, it's very wrong. Again,
should it be illegal?
I don't think so. Again, saying it's illegal is saying, like, you're saying you're going to throw someone in a cage for this. And I don't think that rises to the level of you should throw somebody in a cage, because because now you are advocating real violence against somebody. What I would say is the best solution for it, and I understand this isn't perfect, but throwing someone in a cage for that isn't perfect either. And, it's like, also, there's just a lot of problems with how would you prosecute this? How do you go after somebody? And the Me Too moment alone now is having these problems of, so we just ruin people based off an accusation. Like what with Weinstein, we got a tape out, and so we kind of know what was happening. But no, I would say what you want is a group of people who are, say, fed up with this, hopefully not as psychotic as the current third wave feminists are, but let's say like a group of people who are like recognize that this is wrong, to kind of like give support to women to come out and let people know that this is going on. And hopefully there would be ramifications. I mean, this is a question to me that is, it's a cultural issue. not a state issue. But so no, I would be against throwing that person in a cage. I don't think anybody should have their life and liberty taken from them, send men with guns to go grab them and throw them in a cage unless they have aggressed upon someone. And look, I do agree with you. It's morally really, really shitty to do that. But I can't get on board with arresting
What if
them.
one person owned all the comedy clubs in the United States, and he was a gay man who had a particular thing for, tall, slim Jewish boys?
Well, you got to do what you got to do, man. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Hold my breath, think about my girlfriend.
And, Dave, he looked like Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, God. Man, you're making this worse. Yeah, but see, the problem with that, of course, is that in a free market, I mean, anybody else can go open up a comedy club. So this presents an obvious problem where we need somebody else to
eventually, theoretically, but right now he controls the whole industry. If you don't do what he wants, you don't have a career in comedy, Dave Smith.
Right.
That's a possibility, is it not?
Sure. And well, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine for everybody to one person to own every single comedy club.
In entertainment, there have been monopolies, right?
Sure. Well, in Canada, there's the Yuck Yucks is like the big comedy chain, and it's all owned by one guy. And he doesn't make people suck his dick, but he has like you can't work other clubs in Canada, or he'll like kind of ban you. But what ended up happening because of that was just a lot more clubs rose up because now there's this kind of market demand for other people. Again, it's not that these problems like can't exist. It's just that what the state only has one thing, which is a hammer, which is we can throw people in a cage. And technically speaking, I mean,
the other problem
he is within his rights.
Here's the other problem. So my whole thing with rape, not my whole thing, but to me, one of the answers is to train women to defend themselves physically, and not these bullshit self-defense classes that don't teach them anything really, but like serious martial arts like Brazilian jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai.
I think that's a good idea. I also think there's got to be an aspect, and this is what the third wave feminists fight against, is that there's got to be an aspect of also not putting preventative defense.
But I'm saying that would be of no use in the Harvey Weinstein case,
you're right?
The quid pro quo case, right? Because put Harvey Weinstein in a chokehold, you're definitely never working in this town again.
That's a good point.
So I don't know, man.
I think the only answer that I can see that's reasonable is you want to out these people, is that you want to speak up about it. And look, I mean, even with a guy like Harvey Weinstein who had all this power, I mean, that is essentially what happened to him. That is what happened, is that he got outed and now he's resigning in shame. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't know. I just can't see a better scenario than that. Now, if he did grope someone or did do anything that actually is violent, which I would be quite open to believing. It's certainly possible. Then I think he should face,
well, that's different.
Legal problems.
We all agree on that.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees on that.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees on that.
Of course.
No, it's the quid pro quo. In a situation in which one person has virtual monopoly power on an industry in which the other person wants to work.
The problem is, in these areas, bringing the state in always leads to either a greater moral crime, or it just leads to opening the door to giving power to a group of people that they end up abusing. Yeah. So the idea of the state coming in to solve the problem of quid pro quo is like, it's pretty funny. It's the worst violators of that problem are now coming in to regulate it. And to be honest, I don't trust these sociopaths to do good with their power.
Yeah, I'm right in between here. I don't know.
It's certainly a difficult problem. I don't deny that, like, you're raising a good point. You know what I mean?
I think that a lot of here we go again with like the people you and I and others like us think are crazy. Like, the black kids on college campuses and, Hollywood actresses being hysterical and crazy and going overboard. And obviously they did in many, many ways, but I think we should step back and think about why they might be crazy in this way, and it may not be actually crazy on a fundamental level. In terms of the particular ways in which they express this makes no sense and just doesn't match what we see in the physical world or the real world. But I think there is an underlying thing there, which is, I think if you're an actress in Hollywood, a young actress in Hollywood who wants to ever be the hottie and want to be the leading lady or that kind of actress, right? You're very likely to you're going to be in situations like that, right? I think that's true, that at some point you kind of always live with this possibility, right? And you and I don't think have ever lived with that, even as a thought, like we might have to sleep with someone to have our careers.
Yeah, imagine that. That's never been in my mind.
Imagine that.
No one's propositioning.
Well, maybe it should be.
And I've been waiting.
Maybe it should be in your mind. Maybe it should be in my mind.
But I also think that other people, like the reason I gave that Jimmy Fallon, Louis C.K. example is because essentially what happened to him would be the same fate if like, obviously he didn't have like a monopoly or near monopoly control, but like it's a similar fate. Like you don't get this job because literally just something that's kind of wrong. And I would imagine, I mean, I don't really know, but from what I've heard, there's a lot of gay dudes in Hollywood, and I wouldn't be surprised if there has been that proposition that you laid out to me. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if men have gone through that too.
Oh, sure.
So it's like, I don't know. I mean, I feel bad. I've said this before about the Me Too moment. I feel a lot worse for the chick who turned down Harvey Weinstein's deal and then just doesn't get, to like live her dream than I do for the one who's just like willing to take it and then speaks up later. It's kind of like, well, I mean, you did make a choice. And, I love that there's always these, the examples that a lot of like, anarcho-communist types who I talk to, they'll use examples like in a free market of like, well, what if, somebody has bread and they'll only give you food for your family if you're willing to, have sex with them or something like that. And, which is a much easier problem to solve because food's such a decentralized kind of thing that's near impossible to hold a monopoly on. But I guess maybe I'm just a little bit less sympathetic if it's like, well, do you want to be a rich, famous actress for sleeping with a guy? I mean, I don't know. That's like, yeah, if you have some values, I'd imagine you won't do that.
Wait, I missed that. Why? Which are you?
Well, I'm just making the point
valuing,
I'm just making the point that it's not like his kids are starving. He's not stealing for a loaf of bread to feed their family. Oh. They're literally saying, I'll go blow some guy so I can be an A-list celebrity in a movie.
Wait, do you want to draw a distinction between those two things? As a libertarian, aren't they equally valuable?
Well, I'm not, as a libertarian, I mean, I wouldn't say either one. I'm not advocating the government intervene in either one of them. I'm just saying
you are drawing a line.
Feel as a person, yes, I feel much more for somebody who would hypothetically be doing this to feed their kids.
Wait a minute. Mises said value is subjective.
That's right. So, and this is my subjective value.
Oh, I see. For other people, though, you're making you're saying that their value is wrong. That wanting to be a famous actress is less important than wanting to feed your family.
I'm giving my value, which is that, yes, I'm more sympathetic to someone who's trying to feed their family.
Yeah, but shouldn't you be sympathetic to anyone who has a value? Shouldn't you let their value be autonomous?
Oh, yeah, right? Absolutely.
Sovereign?
Yes,
if you
absolutely.
want X.
Well, that's why I said I'm not advocating government.
But you're drawing distinctions between values here.
No, look, if somebody, let's say there's somebody out there who, I don't know, spends a good portion of their paycheck on really healthy food so their kids can eat good. And then there's somebody else out there who feeds their kids crappy food and then spends the other money on like a flashy car. Mm-hmm. That's the Misesian point, is that that's their expressing their values, what they value.
Right.
I can sit back. I'm not advocating that anybody shouldn't be allowed to do what they do or that they should be thrown in jail. I'm just saying, for me, I value what the person's doing who's feeding their kids healthy food.
No,
more.
You were saying you would have sympathy for one and not so much sympathy for the other.
Right.
Sympathy.
Right.
Well, but I think if you believe that all value is equal, right, because it's all subjective. If it's all subjective, there is no absolute difference between them, then you shouldn't even have
But it's an expression of my values.
You shouldn't have a judgment.
No, I have a right to have my values.
No, but you should be interested in the equal protection, right?
Well, and I am.
Okay.
No, I do. I do think it should be protected. That in the sense that, like, yes, that people should have a right to do what they want to do.
But they should be equally protected.
Yes, legally speaking.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well,
no, I do agree with that.
But not culturally.
No, the culture's a whole different thing. I can feel however I want to feel.
So this is
I can feel like getting a big fancy engagement ring just so you can show off a rich diamond. I can feel like that's a stupid thing to do. But that person expressed their preference for that. Mm-hmm. You get what I'm saying? Like I'm not like you can have whatever. The thing Mises was getting at, like what I think is really brilliant insight, is that if you buy a hat for $10. You're expressing that hat is more valuable to you than $10, and the store owner at the same time is expressing that the $10 are more valuable to him than the hat. And so in a sense, there's that value is subjective in the sense that it's kind of in the eye of the beholder. Mm-hmm. And that I completely agree with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of the things that just boggles my mind. So the vast majority of libertarians, when I talk about relativism, cultural, any kind of relativism, moral relativism, lose their minds. They hate it. They can't stand it. They're allergic to that. And then I say, your boy was a relativist. He was a postmodern relativist. That is Michel Foucault's argument. That is Jacques Derrida's basic argument, is that things are subjective. Now, maybe the difference is that all that Mises was saying was that economic value and only economic value is subjective. And Foucault and Derrida are saying that everything is subjective, and that's my position. But I don't see how you can say economic value is subjective and then say, yeah, but there's a bunch of other stuff that's just absolutely true.
Well, especially Mises' whole outlook on economics was that it is simply human action,
right?
And that's what economics is. So, yeah. but truthfully, he didn't really write, at least that I know of, much about more of kind of like the moral position of that. Whereas Murray Rothbard, who studied under him, did write a lot of this stuff. And yeah. I do think that there are certain, like, I think there is something objectively moral. Look, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not even the right term. But I do think that I do believe that initiating violence on peaceful people is objectively immoral. And I don't mean that as like in a sense that there's some like kind of God, like this is right and this is wrong above us. I just mean it more in kind of like it's inherently more harmonious to not aggress against peaceful people, and inherently kind of more corrupt, almost in the way if you were looking at a computer file that's like just corrupted and not working now, that everything works better for people if we live it this way. And I think that's a big part of why that does resonate with so many people, like something like just slavery being bad. Is it just resonates with so many people because we can all kind of grasp onto that.
So if you value social harmony, yes, then that is an objectively better means than others, right? But that doesn't make it morally good. A moral claim is a claim about something being good or bad for all people at all times forever. That's different, right? Which is basically either religious, it's either religious idea, or it's a natural law idea, right? This thing comes from nature somehow, that's all Thomas Jefferson, John Locke, those guys, classical liberals, your boy Ron Paul, they're part of this. It's one of the weirdest superstitions. I mean, I'm okay with it because most of it serves my interests, but I know that it's just straight up superstition at the bottom of it. It's like, where on earth does nature say there's freedom of speech?
No, I tend to actually agree with you on that. Right? I think there's, it's like, to me, it's the difference between like an is and an ought. Like the idea that we have natural rights is a little bit strange. I'm very on board with the idea that we ought to have natural rights, but it's certainly, I would agree with you that when
you say nothing, ought, though, it's I prefer to say I prefer to live in a world or a country or whatever it is that has this right.
Yeah, no,
rather than other people should have the right.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand. I get what you're saying. I just do. I do agree with you in the sense that there doesn't seem to be a tremendous amount of evidence in nature that natural rights are something we all have.
Zero evidence. Yeah. I mean,
quite to the contrary. Yeah.
So you have animals just killing the fuck out of each other all the time and dominating others, and but also beyond that, just where would you see it? Which blade of grass has the words, freedom of speech shall be protected? There's nothing.
If you're going at it from like an empiricist point of view, I mean, human beings, that doesn't seem to be the natural state of humanity at all. It's quite the exception, not the norm.
Where is it written in nature? That I have a right to speech? Come on, guys. Isn't that amazing? But the whole thing, the United States of America, much of libertarianism, classical liberalism, sort of modern Western liberal democracy is based on that philosophy, which is a straight up, just made up fiction. Yeah. It's kind of amazing. And
although I like it.
I like much of it, except here's a huge problem. Here's a huge problem, is that your boy Ron Paul, thankfully, did not follow it to its logical conclusion, which is that we must invade other countries to make sure other people have those rights. If you believe these things are universal and absolute and sacred and belong to everyone simply by the fact that they are human beings, aren't you obligated to make sure that they live according to those principles from nature?
Yeah,
I'll just tell you real quickly. And then,
sure.
Which is that has precisely been the justification for pretty much every single military operation in the history of the United States. Imperialism, both here and in Britain, was justified by that.
But I'd look at it this way, right? So if you're taking a natural rights position and a non-aggression principle, outlook, you could say something like, okay, so let's say, Assad or someone like that is killing a bunch of his people, and you would say, okay, so he's initiating violence on them, So don't you have the right to go defend these people? And I think the libertarian position would be that, yes, you do. But if you're doing it with our military, who you've now taxed a population who doesn't necessarily want to fight this war, and you're going over there and killing a whole bunch of innocent people, now you're not. So in other words, from a libertarian point of view, it's like, yeah, if you wanted to volunteer to go side with the people fighting against Assad, or side with the people fighting against ISIS for that matter, because it's not really clear that their side's any better, and you were going and defending somebody or bringing someone to justice who had initiated violence, that would be okay. Mm-hmm. But I think Ron Paul, just on a practical matter, understood that spreading, like he said before, he's like, look, I'd like to spread the goodness of natural rights around the world. Just doing it with the military isn't effective, and you end up killing way more people, and of course giving this military industrial complex all the power in the world that they use for evil.
Okay, so there's this guy, I forget his name, but I heard him on the Federalist podcast, who I think he's ex-military, and he has this group, this organization of a bunch of ex-military guys who they fly to Southeast Asia on a regular basis, and they conduct raids on brothels, and they, quote, rescue the girls and women in those brothels and then hand them over to either charities who will take care of them and teach them, proper occupations, or sometimes to the government. But I think usually to charities, like often run by churches. They'll teach them how to cook and sew and clean and all that stuff, right? And I don't know if they've killed anybody, but they're, literally kicking down doors with guns and making everyone line up against the wall. And then they take all the women out. And the women, as far as I know, didn't ask for this. Maybe some of them wanted it. Who knows? That's my point. We don't know what they want.
Right. And I think that's a very good point, though. I mean, and it's, to go in there when you don't know whether this is justified in you breaking someone's door down, you don't know whether these women are there voluntarily or not. I mean, I'd have a big problem with that, too. And I'm saying
this is not the U.S. military. This is ex-military. These guys are private citizens doing this. It's a private corporation doing it, And thankfully, I think it's fairly small. I don't think that they have many guys who are doing this, but it certainly could be in the hundreds or even thousands. You could have, massive, well-armed militias, roaming around the earth, protecting people, saving them. So imperialism can take many forms, and some of those forms are not state-driven.
Absolutely. Just look at gangs or look at private criminals. I mean, there's lots of men with guns who are committing violence against people. The libertarian argument, to me at least, because there's a lot of different types of libertarians, but it's not that only the state are men with guns who are initiating violence against people. It's just that they are also men with guns initiating violence against people. So the same way we'd look at a gang who's doing that, I mean, really what the U.S. did in Iraq is just like the most well-organized gang. Mm-hmm.
So we assume that those guys, I've heard them talk, they assume that women in prostitution are doing that against their will because it's just unnatural for a woman to want to sell her body, right? So they make this universal absolute assumption about all women who have ever lived, right?
Right.
And whoever will live. So it is a natural law proposition. It's not exactly the one that Jefferson put forward, but it's pretty close. And in fact, many, many American political leaders and theorists have said this, and many classical liberals have said it too, because it's just not natural for women to want to do that.
Which again kind of defies all the evidence that it's like, they call it the oldest profession for a reason. It seems like there is something natural about trading sex for money.
And therefore they are in effect slaves. And we must free the slaves, shouldn't we? Aren't we obligated, Dave, to free the slaves? Well, it's of course, and this is certainly from John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, indirectly, but certainly from John Locke, that, it is not natural, right? It is against the natural order for human beings to be enslaved, to be chattel. So, I mean, it's our duty, isn't it, to go and find those people and liberate them, whether we have the government behind us or not.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, right. So I'm with you on this, that I think this is kind of crazy. And there's also, the thing that Jefferson, I like a lot of what of Locke and Jefferson wrote. I mean, I really like a lot of it. But the thing that Jefferson even writes in the Declaration of Independence, that it's like, I forget the exact language, but like, this is why governments are created. You know, like recognizing natural rights. This is why we create government. I mean, I think Murray Rothbard's Anatomy of the State is a much better explanation for why governments are created, which is essentially to rule over other people. Mm-hmm. And this is just kind of, it's a nice idea, but there's really no evidence that this is the natural state or that this is why governments are created. It's just, it's not the case.
The Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. First of all, an interesting assumption. Hard to prove that one. But,
well, I think it's actually fairly easy to disprove. I mean, it depends on exactly what you mean by equal, but the idea that men are created equal, I mean, we can look at any number of ways in which they are absolutely, demonstrably not created equal.
I don't see a way to prove it. But it's also just an absolute universal claim. Did Thomas Jefferson did he observe every person on earth? How does he know?
That's a good point.
How does he know they're all equal? Right?
But okay, so But I'm saying you would need, theoretically, right, you would need to observe every person on Earth in order to prove that, but you wouldn't need to observe every person on Earth to disprove it.
Correct.
You could just observe two people and disprove that. I mean, just observe me and LeBron James playing basketball, and you could say, oh, nope, not created equal.
So the founding idea of this nation is totally absurd.
Yeah.
You and I agree.
Yes,
wow.
Absolutely.
Look at that. Look what we just did. Sitting right across from the federal building.
Let's go storm that place.
But, right? It just is amazing to me that people don't notice this. Okay, but that's just the top of the Declaration of Independence. There's another section a little farther down. So all men are created equal. Okay, so you might suppose that therefore all men should be created equal or treated equal, right? Equally. And is that implicit in the document? And there's been debate about that. Well, further down in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson uses the word duty when he talks about the people's right to overthrow despots. Mm-hmm. He then says it is their right, it is also their duty. Now, which people and which despots? Because the leaders of the Iraq War, the neocons, Paul Wolfowitz and those cats, that was precisely their argument, that it was our duty to overthrow that despot over there, Saddam Hussein. So it comes all from natural law, the basis of classical liberalism, which is, I'm sorry to tell you, the basis of libertarianism. Now, doesn't mean that in itself is not a challenge to libertarian politics today. What I've been trying to tell libertarians, one of the things I've been trying to tell them, is that they got to get rid of this bullshit, these absolute moral claims. You can have exactly the same politics that you have, Dave, exactly, I think, in terms of policy, the state, economics, all that stuff. But just don't, when you use these, and I don't know that you do, I'm not even sure you do, but I know that others do who have similar politics to you. They make these absolute natural law claims, which are moral claims, right? Almost all of them do, in fact, all the time. You're simply handing a weapon to your worst enemies. All the imperialists of all kinds have used exactly that argument. Okay,
but then let me ask you this: so essentially your argument is against any absolute moral claim, right? Mm-hmm. So are you uncomfortable saying slavery is immoral?
Yeah, I don't say it.
Right. So you don't think that's a fair statement?
It is immoral according to whom? So I'll tell you who it's immoral to. Less than 1% of the people who have lived.
Yeah.
Right? Because of course it was considered, and by the way, people just think black people in the United States were enslaved. They were a tiny fraction of the people who've been enslaved. Everybody's had their turn.
Yeah.
An old friend of mine who's an Israeli has said, the Jews, of course, were slaves. And he said, yeah, everybody took their turn. It's true. Pretty much everybody who's living now has ancestors who were enslaved, and not even that long ago. So slavery was considered to be a natural thing, an inevitable thing, and for many people a good thing. Until about 2 minutes ago, historically. If you look at if you were to chart all of human history on the wall, it would be just the last millimeter of that timeline would be when people thought, generally speaking, and that's only in the West also, by the way, that it was immoral. It was totally fine until the 19th century.
Right, but whether or not it was perceived as immoral, I mean, I don't know that there's not, that proves that there's not such thing as morality.
No.
I mean, something like whatever it is within human beings. I mean, seeing, and certainly, not all groups of humans agree with this, but the idea of slaughtering innocent people, starving innocent people, enslaving people, it seems to certainly, there's an emotional kind of something that resonates with people.
When you say emotional, you mean a natural response?
Maybe. I don't know.
Really?
Well, certainly. I mean, I preface by saying, obviously, lots of groups of people have not felt this way. But it does seem to me that there's, for a lot of people, something that emotionally resonates about that. And you know what I mean? Like, isn't there something to saying these things are wrong and speaking in kind of a moral language?
I think the evidence...
I believe that they're wrong.
The evidence that I've seen tells me that most people actually don't care much when they see evidence of mass slaughter of civilians, right? I mean, so... How many Americans cried over Hiroshima?
Yeah, no, you're right.
How many I don't know.
No, not even that. A lot more celebrated.
I have seen almost no evidence of any American crying over Hiroshima. I'm sure some did.
Yeah, but way more celebrated it.
Obviously, the vast majority not only didn't cry, they celebrated it. And then they dropped another one on Nagasaki, and I've not heard of anyone crying over that either. So dropping a second one, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I actually, this is the most indefensible part of World War II, which, as you pointed out last time we were on the podcast, is really kind of like the ground framework for the entire, like, kind of the entire modern American lens. And it's like, the war in Europe is over. There's absolutely no threat. Japan has retreated from China. There's like no threat at all at this point. We've got them cornered. And now it's like, let's target civilians.
Yes. And the New York Times is reporting every single day the numbers of Japanese dead, all through the war, long before Hiroshima, every single day, and American dead, by the way. And it just becomes numbers because it's so big. They can't keep track. You can't name them anymore when it's in the hundreds every single day.
I can't remember where I read this, but it was something about like Truman was on a ship of some sort when the first bomb dropped, and there's like several different firsthand accounts that said he was like running around cheering and like was just like thrilled about it. And you're like, man, you don't even have like a somber attitude. Like it's like, yay.
Yeah, but see, don't blame just Truman. That was actually a democratic decision, basically. I think he was actually expressing the will of most American people, the majority, and certainly most American servicemen. And so there have been many scholars, activists, political people who are very left-wing, very opposed to the American empire, very anti-interventionist and all sorts of things, who were nonetheless serving in the Pacific War, who said, yeah, but except for that, that was a good thing, because otherwise, guess what? I would have been sent onto the mainland of Japan to occupy that country, right? And that was a very dangerous thing to do. But not just World War II, Vietnam. I mean, yes, we think Vietnam, there was just a huge anti-war movement. No, in fact, most people thought it was a good thing until the very end. Most Americans either supported it or just didn't care. And was it covered? Oh, yeah. This was when we actually had reporters in the field with cameras taking pictures of pretty much everything. Napalm, children running through the streets with their skin burning off, and, rows of corpses in Cambodia and elsewhere. This was all seen. Did Americans all get upset? No. I think very few did.
It's not really until the consequences of the war start to hit that Americans start getting upset. I think that was true in Iraq as well. It's like after you start to see the bodies coming back, and you see kind of this, and that it's not doing anything, and that it's not in your interest, then people start kind of but the lead up to the war in Iraq, people were way on board with it. I mean, it's like and I think Vietnam, similar thing. Yep. It's like after a while where you're like, oh wait, they're drafting my cousin and my brother, and he's coming back in a body bag, and all, it's like the wars get a lot less popular.
You ever had violent fantasies?
Sure.
Yeah, like big time violent fantasies, like involving killing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, me too. Lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think it's very natural to have an emotional negative response to violence, even violence against civilians, because I'm sure your violent fantasies were sometimes directed toward just civilians, not generals in the Marine Corps or the head of the people in the federal building across the street, right? So yeah, nothing's natural, man. And I really think that everyone should get out of the business of making moral claims. You don't need to, first of all. You can have exactly the same politics, have exactly the same consequences, the same effect without making those claims. Making the claims does nothing but give ammunition to the Paul Wolfowitzes and the Bill Kristols of the world, because that's exactly what they rely on. And they have a point. That Constitution and all the ideas that came out of the Founding Fathers, which is what they all talk about and refer to, does have this universal moral claim, which pretty clearly to me and some scholars is not just a claim that people have rights, but an injunction that we have an obligation and a duty as America, the exceptional country, the exceptional city upon a hill, to expand our goodness. This is the best way to live. We have proven, we know that we live in the best way human beings can live. Well, isn't it, it's just selfish for us to keep that to ourselves. It's God's will. God wants people to live well, doesn't he? And we live the best, so we must, we know this is true, that everything, after all the political discourse in foreign policy in this country, all of it, you know this, since then has used that as the justification for the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yemen even, right? We can't let those mullahs take over in Yemen, right? That's a terrible way to live. They're oppressors. They don't live according to natural law. There's no freedom of speech in Iran. We can't allow that to happen. We've got to destroy them. So James Mattis and those guys, they have a point. They have a great argument, actually, as Americans within that discourse. Within the discourse, I'm sorry to tell you, that Ron Paul uses, that Murray Rothbard, I guess, used, that most libertarians that I know of use all the time. I think it's also get out of this constitutionalist bullshit. It's
I agree with that.
It's not only a dead end. I'm saying it actually has a bad end more often than not. It's going to work against you. If you're an anti-imperialist, anti-interventionist, it's almost always going to work against you.
But with that, so you're saying in general that if you believe in any sense of morality, then you're giving into the idea of imperialism, because then you can be for spreading the morality?
Well, so it may not require intervention, but it is imperialist already because you're making claims on behalf of other people you've never met, other people you don't even know exist. You're making claims for everyone who's ever lived and who ever will live, right? If you say that something is good or bad morally, aren't you?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, what the fuck? Who the fuck are you to make a claim for every human being ever?
Yeah, no, you're right. It certainly is more of a belief than an empirical claim. But I do have the belief. I mean, even that, I do kind of think it would be really great if Iran embraced freedom and that they weren't run by secular. I'm sorry, that they weren't run by theocratic, oppressors.
But why?
But it is. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. Why do you care?
Well, I don't care enough to want to go bomb the crap out of them, that's for sure.
Oh.
But I do think a group of people have a right to determine how they live, or ought to have a right to determine how they live. I think that I just think that in general it's much better for peace and prosperity, and it's better for kind of human flourishing and achievement. However, I think that people have a right to voluntarily join whatever group they want.
Mm-hmm. So human flourishing according to your own values. So you're saying that it would benefit you.
No, I don't know if it would benefit
then
me.
Why do you
I
care?
feel like they would benefit from it.
No, see, this is my point here. So I think unless it benefits you, it's not your business. Now, it could benefit you, even what goes on in Iran. I think it does actually benefit us to have an open society there.
Sure.
But that's only according to my values, right? Because I'm not a Muslim. I'm not an authoritarian.
I agree.
I want to trade with those people. I want to visit Iran.
Right,
I want them to visit here. I want, open trade, open exchange between those two places. What they do on their own time in Tehran, I don't care that much about unless it is essentially imprisoning themselves and closing themselves off to the rest of the world. Now, I would let them do that, but I would prefer. That's all you got to say. I'd prefer it because it would be better for me, and that's it. It's a purely self-interested claim here, right? I think it would be better for me for all countries to be open.
But you don't think it would be better for, say, women in Iran?
Hell no. Ask the women in Iran. Now, many of them absolutely are straight-up feminists who are literally throwing their veils off in public, and it's an amazing thing. And heroic according to their own terms and according to the terms of feminism. But no, there's many women in Iran, of course, who are fucking Muslim. And they're fundamentalists. And they believe that women should be covered head to toe.
Right.
And that their sexuality is a threat and a danger and should be hidden and shunned constantly. And polls have been taken of women in Afghanistan who want the Taliban to come back. There's not a majority, but it's a significant minority.
Yeah, that's for sure.
There's a hell of a lot of women in the Middle East who absolutely think we are fucking imperialists, and they're right. They're Muslims, and they're very strict Muslims, and they think Sharia law is a great thing.
Yeah, well, there's no question. There's a lot of people in the Muslim world who think Sharia law is a great thing.
And there are women in many countries in Africa and in South Asia who believe that clitorectomies of young girls are necessary. It's God. It's what God wants, and it's good. And right. And this is, of course, that's the classic feminist conundrum, that one.
Yeah.
What do we do as feminists? It's imperialist to tell them that they should do something differently, but then, boy, it sure isn't very feminist to be cutting off girls' clitorises. But I don't see how it's not imperialist to claim that they're doing something wrong.
I do tend to agree with you on that. I don't think we have any right to impose our way of life on other people. So I do agree with you that. You've given me a lot to think about with the morality stuff, though. I do. I have to think this through a bit. But I do think it's one of the things, just to touch on this, fascinating about the feminist dynamic they find themselves in is that, and it really does get kind of revealed that they're not, and this is true for the left in general, they're not really relativists. They kind of use that, but they really just hate white Christian straight cis men. I mean, that's who the bad guy is, because they have no problem taking the gloves off with Christianity. But when Islam is a worse offender on all of the exact issues that they have a problem with Christianity, they're still yelling about how some Christian doesn't want to bake a cake for a gay couple. Right. But they look at how gay people are treated in the Muslim world, and it's
oh yeah, no, they're completely not essential. They're anti-essentialist, right? They are essentialist. The big claim nowadays, especially on race, but also for women too, is I am born this way and this is my destiny, my race. I am black and that means this, this, and this, and it always will mean this about me. It is my past, it is my present, it is my future. You're white and that means the same things about you. It's your race determines who you are and what you will be and what you can do in this world. There's actually a term for the Ta-Nehisi, that's basically Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument. There's a term for this line of thought in Black intellectual history. It's called Afro-pessimism, which is that it's just an eternal condition that Black people will always be oppressed. There will always be racism and oppression of Black people, and white people will always be racist. And so all we can do is just point it out. That's the tradition he belongs to. It's called Afro-pessimism. It's actually a developed literature. It began in the 1970s. It's a minority position even among
what's so strange
the Black left, but it's quite something.
It is.
But it's also but your point about this was that it's essentialist, right? They're saying your race is determinative. They're biological, racist, determinist.
But what's even crazier to me, and which I just completely disagree with, but what's crazy to me with all this stuff is how they will contradict themselves from sentence to sentence, because then they'll also say that there's no such thing as race and that it's a social construct. They'll say there's no such thing as gender and it's a social construct, but also I knew I was a man from the age I was 4 years old. And you're like, well, you could have one of those things, but you sure as hell can't have both of those things.
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
So and there just seems to be, it almost seems at that point that there's kind of a rejection of logical consistency at all. I mean, it's not a concern.
Exactly. Yeah. The trans movement, I mean, it's just been sort of tragic in some ways, because I was really turned on by the theories that originated the trans movement, which was what I'm talking about, which comes out of what's called queer theory, which is made fun of all the time. But actually, I think it's one of the most liberatory bodies of thought ever that the Academy's ever produced, which simply said, your dick is not your destiny. Your body is not your destiny. You can gender, yes, has been constructed. It's been constructed in infinite ways. Even within the categories, men have been constructed. The category of a man has been looked different constantly in everywhere, every time in history, right? And why do we draw the distinction here? Why is there one line between, half the population and the other half? Why is the line there? Is it having a penis? Well, some men don't have penises. Right. Is it the chromosomes? Well, actually, some people we classify as men don't have the proper chromosomes, et cetera, right? And those have been fluid. So why are we so concerned about, first of all, categorizing? Even if it is true, it hasn't been proven. But so the queer theory begins in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which comes out of feminism. And this is the thing. A lot of people on the alt-right and a lot of libertarians, a lot of this sort of new right, whatever it is, movement, they're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So they hear these idiot 19-year-old kids on college campuses screaming about white supremacy at Yale, right? Which is just clearly absurd, and a lot of other things as well, none of which are good. But they then, from that, conclude that everything that's been taught in the academy over the last 50 years is garbage and responsible for this. In fact, very little of it is responsible for it. The original stuff, this has been my thing for a long time now, right, publicly. One of the great feminist insights is this, right, that your biology does not determine you, and nor should it, right? And imagine that, if your biology, the way you were born, your body, determines what job you should have, like how you should dress, how you should speak, who you should have sex with, who you should want to have sex with. Talk about imprisonment and authoritarianism, right? And that's totally cultural. It's also been enforced by law, of course,
sure.
But even if it's not, right? So it's an amazing liberatory idea, right? That our bodies do not determine us. If you're Jewish, if you're born Jewish, which is also totally absurd, but of course this is how many people have thought, oh, well, you're definitely going to be better at math. Or if you're born Chinese, you're going to be really good at engineering. If you're born black, you're going to be a good dancer, but not so good at the math part. Now, culturally, generally speaking, yeah, that's been more or less true. But there's also been so many exceptions.
Right. So isn't that kind of like the conclusion of that is something like in the direction of something individualist? I mean, it's like the idea is like, well,
exactly.
Yes, in large demographics, it might be more likely that someone in this, condition ends up here. But there's always exceptions to the rule, and that basically people should be judged as individuals.
Yeah.
But it seems to very weirdly, like the whole intersectionality thing just became another way to collectivize people.
Right. So yes. So gender theory and queer theory, right? That's where they started. That is cultural libertarianism. It's fabulous from my point of view. If you're interested in individual human liberty, you should be a gender theorist in that way. Now, you're completely right, though. It's been. I don't want to use the word perverted because that assumes that there's some natural, essential way to interpret that stuff. But
it's been kind of hijacked.
It's been flipped in a way. It's been flipped, I think. Yeah, because it's really contrary to the original arguments being made in the 60s and 70s by those first gender theorists, which is that women are born this way, this is the way we are, and men are born this way, and they're natural aggressors and predators, et cetera, and same with blacks and whites, right? So, and trans, right? I was born a woman. That's Caitlyn Jenner's whole thing. I was born a woman. Well, that is completely the opposite of what the originators of your movement thought. So
right. No, I think that. And one of the things that I think leads to kind of when you're talking about the new right who kind of rejects this stuff and will throw out the baby with the bathwater, I think that a lot of those kind of original ideas that you're talking about that really do, as you said, kind of result in kind of cultural individualism, I think a lot of them have been accepted broadly in American society. So in terms of like the idea that like whatever, a woman's role is here or a man's role is here or that, I think largely, I mean, again, I guess you'd say compare to what, but we did become a pretty individualist society, certainly compared to most societies that exist.
Legally
we
certainly
speaking,
did.
Yeah.
Legally we certainly did.
So I think, but even culturally to some degree.
With one important exception, sex work.
Yeah.
So we still have laws against women
that is
doing the unnatural thing.
That is a very good point.
Yeah,
sure.
Otherwise, yes.
But generally, broadly speaking, no pun intended. But what's interesting is that once all that stuff kind of becomes somewhat accepted, and then it kind of it goes more and more into like an identity politics kind of direction as it has, and into more of like a collectivist thing than the individualist thing that it started as. What's interesting to me about the alt-right is that it's almost like, at first it seems almost like the right kind of embraced those basic things. Like no one's really arguing like women shouldn't vote or women shouldn't have X or Y, freedom to do these things. But now it's almost like what the alt-right has done is they've embraced all of it and flipped it on them. Like they've embraced, to me, the alt-right, and Donald Trump in a lot of ways just symbolized this. It's like the right using this left narrative against the left.
Identity politics.
Yeah, it's like, so you want to do this. You want to say like, you want to break people into these groups and say white men are the aggressors.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's look at crime stats.
Right.
And let's see if white men are the aggressors or black men are the aggressors. Right. Since we're playing identity politics and it's a given now that that's okay, well, let's flip it on you and I'm going to be the white identity politics side. And by the way, I reject all of it. I don't like any of this stuff because I'm an individualist, but it's like, there is something that's hard to not almost kind of be like, they kind of got you there. And they kind of got you.
And the major argument of the alt-right and Richard Spencer and those guys is, Western civilization is terrible, okay, and created by white people. Oh, okay, well then get the fuck out.
Right, which is a really difficult position.
This is our place then.
It's a really hard, once you've embraced any of this left-wing narrative today, they've boxed themselves into a corner that you can't really argue it. It's like, this is a horrible white supremacist country. Also, we have to let a whole bunch of brown people into it.
Yeah,
it's like, well, hey, I mean, why would you want to come to this horrible white supremacist country? Let's keep them out because, we're so horrible to them. And
I've talked about this before, but now I'm actually putting it together in a different way. This is what I should have been saying about when Richard Spencer talks about an ethno-state. Did you ever see the Roland Martin interview with him?
Yeah, I did see that.
Right, so Roland Martin is just absolutely outraged that he wants a separate white ethno-state where he will take all of the racists and they will live separately from the rest of the world, right? This is the worst possible thing and this is an outrage. It's like, no, that's exactly what you should want as an identity politics person, right? If you believe that white people are, certainly these white people are inherently racist, right? If you're an Afro-pessimist, the way that Ta-Nehisi Coates is, right? Then you should exactly want that. You should agree. It's, do you know that the Ku Klux Klan had a business deal with Marcus Garvey in the 1920s?
Yes, that's right.
They actually helped to finance the ships that took many black people from America to Liberia, which was the founding of Liberia in Africa.
Because white separatists and black separatists are natural allies.
And Malcolm X did too. He had some talks at least and so did Elijah Muhammad, had talks with actual straight up racists.
I think Muhammad Ali talked at a Ku Klux Klan
probably
meeting.
did because they actually understood. See, this is the thing about Malcolm and those guys, like they actually get this. It's like, if you want to be separate, that's how you do it, right? If these people over here are your natural enemies, then and so they all agree. Yeah, they all agree. And so I want to say to the Afro-pessimists now, the people who talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates in this, or that love Ta-Nehisi Coates in this whole argument about how racism is eternal, right?
Right.
It's like, well, then you should be donating to Richard Spencer's organization. Seriously, don't you want them to live separate from you? Isn't he your greatest gift?
Yeah, it's so strange, man. And they weirdly, they both fuel each other so much. Yeah. You could see the whole mainstream media kind of falls in love with Richard Spencer. I mean, in hate, but in infatuation with him, because it's like, well, they want that to be the Trump supporter. They want that to be that. They have an interest in that. And then the craziest social justice warrior idiot who's 19, the alt-right wants that to be it's like, hey, look at that guy, because they both empower themselves, because it is kind of there's this inherent agreement with that worldview. Either they kind of prove each other right. They prove, if Richard Spencer is the average Donald Trump supporter, well, then the social justice warriors have been proven right. This is the country we live in. And if the social justice warriors do embrace this logic, then Richard Spencer's been proven right. And they both feed off each other.
Yeah, black people, you are actually under threat. This is true. There are Richard Spencers in this world, many of them, and they will try to kill you, and so you need a protector.
Yeah.
And guess who? The protector is us, until you find out that we're white too, in which case, which is where Ta-Nehisi Coates has been going recently, by the way. He's been saying, sort of slipping in to these articles he's writing, things about liberals being just as racist as Bull Connor ever was. I mean, really, it is all the same continuum. It's the same thing. It's slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, redlining, and today's New Yorker liberals. Basically all the same, fundamentally, almost biologically, is the claim he's making. So it's like, oh, well, now we really do have to have a separate state. So Richard Spencer then actually is, and Spencer himself has said this, by the way, he is their hero. He's trying to take all of the whites out of this society.
Yeah, really, what could be better for him by their thinking? Now, I just want to say, I don't mean to make a false equivalency, not between Richard Spencer and those guys, but just between the right and the left, because I actually do think racism, if you're going to put it that way, where looking at the left's racism as well, I do think the left is way worse right now, because Richard Spencer represents this very fringe movement on the right, and the identity politics represents the majority of the left right now. So it really is, I actually do think the left is quite a bit more racist on average than the right is today in America. Now, the right's got their own problems, and they worship the cops and the military and a lot of other things that I think are bad. But in terms of just really being trained to see everyone in terms of these collectives, I mean, you have to everybody on the left. It's it permeates the college mind that everyone has to first and foremost be seen through. I mean, Ben Shapiro was giving this talk at a university the other day. I forget what college it was. And he was taking questions afterward. And it's unbelievable how shameless these guys are in their questions. But this woman actually asks him, she goes, she goes, as a woman who's entering the medical industry, How do you, she goes, this is about abortion. How do you, as a wealthy white man, argue against abortion? Mm-hmm. And it's just like right away, like this is the thing. Like, how can you have your take on abortion as this group that you're in? Yeah. Like, you're not allowed to have this thought. Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing.
Right. And so what men and white men have been doing for several years now is continuing to have those thoughts, right? Because you can't just get rid of those thoughts. And they've just been doing it on their own. They've been speaking those thoughts to each other in places like the internet, right? And in places like podcasts. So podcasting and then YouTube, right, has been that domain largely, right? You see a lot of this kind of expression of masculinity and sort of what's called race realism and just sort of anti-PC stuff. It's been an amazing phenomenon of which I am somewhat a part, or at least I'm involved in it. I'm trying to do my part to sort of at least steer that weird giant ship in directions I think might be better. But you are part of that very much so, even more so, especially on the man side, right? So you have another podcast. You have one podcast that's really political, in which you do your libertarian thing. Your stand-up is mostly libertarian, political, right? Yeah. But then you do another podcast with some dudes. Yes. And it's very much a dude podcast.
The Legion of Skanks.
The Legion of Skanks are right there. We kind of get a feeling of the themes here. And I haven't listened to it, I'll tell you. I just be honest with you. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of rage among young men in particular, and I include men in their 30s like you as young, that's being expressed in all these ways that are sort of subterranean or semi-subterranean, and then in some, it gets found out that so-and-so said something on a 4chan thing, and then it's national news. But this stuff's going on all the time, kind of underground. It's almost like pornography, right? It's like we all know it's everywhere, but it's nowhere simultaneously, because you don't see these people on the streets, right? I think, by the way, isn't this weird? Like, apparently, and truly, there are like hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of young men who have these alt-right ideas of some sort or another, who say racist shit, like really bad, or really make rape jokes all the time. I assume they walk the earth just like the rest of us.
They sure do.
But they're not visible. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but like there's also like this real thing where it's been driven underground, I think very repressed, which is kind of interesting, because like, traditionally speaking, it was kind of the opposite that was repressed. But the truth is that there's this big disconnect. And this is one of the things where even I will, and I'm not like an alt-right guy, I'm not into this race realism stuff at all, but even I will, there's something kind of fun about watching someone just say something that has become the most dangerous thing to say. And the fact is that there's this big disconnect between what a lot of people believe and what they will say in respectable public. Mm-hmm. And like, if you look at people's actions, right? Like, this is the kind of the Misesian insight that you can learn a lot more from people's actions. Mm-hmm. That it's like, white people will live like an hour and a half outside of New York City to be in a white neighborhood when there's way more affordable real estate in Harlem, and they come into work every day. I mean, there is a lot, I'm not saying it's 100%, but there's a lot of self-segregation. There's a lot of different groups of people, and people do, I think, privately, most people have some bigotries about them. Now, I'm not saying that they're all on the same level, but I think there's a lot of...
But one thing we know for sure is that no man has ever said, except for the president, I would grab her by her pussy.
No one would say something as terrible as that.
Right. That was your insight, is that it's completely commonplace, even for liberals, to say stuff like that in private.
Oh, it's like, if you want to be honest about what guys in locker rooms say, and also what women in locker rooms say. I mean, I was talking about this with my girlfriend once recently, where she was there was someone, I can't remember if it was CNN or MSNBC, but we were watching someone, and she said the thing of, she said 100% of women have either been the victims of sexual assault, sexual harassment, or inappropriate jokes. And my girlfriend just goes, inappropriate jokes? It's like, do you know what me and my girls at work, like the jokes we make about guys too? So it's also kind of this thing where it's like, it's not just... like
it's one of the most authoritarian words, inappropriate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
I was called inappropriate when I was fired from Barnard. My work, not me. My work was called inappropriate. But I just hate that.
It just translates to, in any way, going against what we consider the norms, or any way, Yeah. So I do think that there is, like, while we would probably agree that it's like, you wouldn't want to like you wouldn't want to repress in any way people who don't fit into, say, like gender norms or what are considered gender norms, and that there are more individualists and there are different individuals, and they should be free to do, you know, kind of what they live their lives the way they want to, or they're so inclined to. But at the same time, like what we've kind of done now is flip it, where it's like the kind of anyone who is in traditionally what we'd consider male or traditionally female, they seem to be kind of under assault. And I think that does like I think some of the stuff you're talking about and what we do on Legion of Skanks is a lot of just like, hey, like no rules. If we want to be offensive, we'll be offensive. It's just a few guys sitting around like talking, being really dirty, being really over the top. And it's there does seem to be like a desire for that by a lot of people.
Yeah, so the humor, the discourse of that world that I've seen could be classified as adolescent.
Sure.
Adolescent and male. And it certainly reminds me a whole lot of the way that I talked and my buddies talked when I was a teenager in my 20s, before I went to college, or certainly graduate school. But right, so I think that's really what's going on. And I'm not judging it. I'm just saying that's kind of typical for adolescent male.
Absolutely.
And a lot of, obviously, men. Look, there is still to this day no such thing as an unfunny fart joke to me. Like, it's always funny.
Absolutely.
Farts are always funny. Still, I'm 52 years old.
Yep.
Fart is funny. Period. That's it. It is naturally, essentially, absolutely, universally funny.
No, I also think there's something about comedians that is inherently kind of immature.
So
comedians are somewhat professionally we work on jokes.
So civilization demands that we grow up.
Sure.
Civilization demands that we no longer be children. It demands that we do work instead of make fart jokes. It demands that we get a job and become a husband and produce children. We're productive in multiple ways, productive and reproductive. So you wanting to play in your adolescent male playpen is not just not contributing to civilization, it's actually a threat to civilization because it's very attractive. That's the problem. See, even Thaddeus Russell thinks that fart jokes are funny. So in me, there's this potential to go hang out with you.
Right.
And say these things on Legion of Skanks or just in private or on 4chan or whatever it is, right? Within all of us, there's this desire to be children. But the way that you are a child, although women get this too, they have their own version of it, right? But for men, this is the thing that is constantly policed and always has been. This is Freud's argument about civilization and its discontents, basically. So civilization represses all of the expressions, all of the desires, all of the freedoms of childhood.
That's very interesting.
It makes us grow up, become responsible, have less fun, renounce fun, think fun is not so good. Work is good. Family is good.
I always loved that about George Carlin, that like he'd have like this bit, like this brilliantly like well-crafted, well-structured bit that really made you think about everything about our society, and then he would just have like a fart joke the next joke. You know what I mean? They'd just be right next to each other in the special.
Exactly.
And you just be like, and you can kind of, I mean, there is something that is inherently kind of adolescent about it, but it really does appeal to that part of your kind of thing. It's like they just rethink this whole thing.
Yeah, the theme of this podcast is saying things you're not supposed to say. Right. That's it. And that is often juvenile by definition, in a sense, right? Because you're saying what grown-ups don't say in this society. Now, as long as it's doesn't constitute any threat, as long as there's no sort of policy emanating from it, you're saying, and I mostly agree with you, maybe we should be on the side of anyone who expresses juvenile thoughts, unless we are on the side of the builders of civilization, who in our case happen to be the greatest villains ever.
Well, that's right.
The dead white men, racist, sexist, patriarchal, etc. Right? So what I'm saying to you, left wing, think about whose side you're on when you fight, when you go after people like the Legion of Skanks and all of these boys acting like boys on the internet, the so-called alt-right, which I think is overwhelmingly that. I think maybe there's a few hundred possibly serious, intellectual, politically active, activist, organizing racists, white supremacists, overwhelmingly, I think the so-called alt-right is young men saying things they're not supposed to say. And they get pleasure from that, from simply breaking the rules. And yes, it sounds like 14-year-olds, what 14-year-olds say. It sounds like what I said when I was a 14-year-old, almost exactly. That's really how I talked when I was 14 and even 17 and 18. But it's a revolt against civilization, because Freud said that the repressed will return. The return of the repressed. If you repress these desires for freedom, for pleasure, they're going to come back in uglier ways.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And that's the big thing. That's the big warning to the left that they really, really should heed, because it's really important. And the idea that, as you've kind of said, like, it's like if you have some perspective, and historically, which like you do, which is kind of rare these days, understand that you, despite your belief that like race is a social construct and things like that, you go. But if you want to talk about what we were talking about before, what is human nature? It does certainly seem to be very in human nature to divide into groups.
Well, human nature. Yeah, we just covered this, Dave. There's no such thing.
So let me rephrase. let me rephrase.
It's okay.
Tendencies that we can observe through history do seem to be to treat this construct as if it's real, and to be tribal and divide into these constructs. And if you want to compare us to other societies, like say American society over the last 50 years, we've been pretty good in comparison about not, not getting into these racial tribal groups. And the idea, to me, what I say to the left is, it's like, if you want to keep pushing this thing, and you want to keep pushing this thing, you are going to be looking at, you want to keep lecturing straight white men. As, by the way, you have these different dynamics where, like, so there's the Obama recovery, but the Obama recovery never really hit the Rust Belt. It never really hit these areas. It's kind of this statist recovery that, like, the stock market's going up and these districts outside Washington and outside New York are getting really rich. While you want to keep lecturing these people. You want to keep dividing us into these collectivist groups. It's like, just get ready for something 10 times worse than Charlottesville. That's going to be the inevitable outcome of this. And I just say to people on the left, I know it's nice for a lot of these, like, like Marxist college kids who are like, oh, we want a revolution or something like this. It's like, okay, just realize the other side has all the guns. The other side has the vast majority of the cops and the military on their side. I've said this on my podcast before, people like this quote, but I said, anyone who's concerned about microaggressions is not ready for a war. So just you're going to provoke something here, and it's going to be really, really bad. And I do think that people like me and you, who are pretty like harsh critics of the kind of modern lefty stuff, it's like, we really don't want to see this thing rise up on the other side either. And it's like, if you think Richard Spencer's bad, get ready for something way worse than that. Yeah. And it's like, things can go that way.
The only reason I'm not concerned about the alt-right is because I think they're actually possibly the least powerful people in this country.
No, I agree with that. Believe me, if those guys were about to seize some type of government power, they would be a real threat. But I do agree. It's hard for me, and this is what really pissed me off after Charlottesville, when the entire media, it's like an outrage that Trump said there's bad people on both sides rather than just condemning the alt-right side. Right. And it's like, okay, so you have this alt-right guys who really did, they got permission and went through all the legal channels to have this march. And then you have this group Antifa, and it came to a violent clash. But Antifa is out at every like free speech rally, at every Republican speaking on a college campus, and they are given aid and comfort by college professors. I mean, this left-wing thing has so much more actual power. But I'm just saying, the people,
I know,
don't have guns.
Right.
And the other side does.
Right.
Just be careful. That's my message to the left.
When we really get down to it, they're playing revolution now.
Yes.
They're totally playing because they don't constitute a threat yet to the state. But if they did, and when they do, we know from history, right? There isn't just one example. There's thousands of examples of movements like that becoming serious, becoming armed, becoming a real revolutionary force. And guess what happens, right? As you know, as you're saying, lots of people die. Yeah. It's not pretty on both sides, but more likely it's going to be the Antifa. Believe me, the Antifa against the United States Marine Corps, I'm going to bet on the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I'd go with them.
So to me, the alt-right is the return of the repressed. That's what it is. And the sad thing to me, really sad, I despair because, I come from the left, and the left has some things in its history that I do, as I've been saying already, very liberatory. And one of the things that came from the left that I do think is liberatory is this idea of repression being not so good. Now, Freud wasn't so great on it himself, but after Freud in the 20s and 30s and 40s, there were a lot of social psychologists, social scientists of the left, basically, who were saying, yeah, there's this fight between civilization and the repressed all the time, but repression sucks because it, first of all, takes the form of things like making homosexuality illegal or shaming homosexuals or shaming women for being promiscuous or having sexual desires. And it's also about shaming men who don't work, who don't become CEOs, who aren't ambitious, right? Lots of shame goes on. That's repression. So that's a left-wing idea that I'm putting forward here, really. And it's certainly not a conservative idea, right?
Sure.
It is it's obviously definitionally anti-conservative. Civilization is conservative. It's trying to conserve this thing, this structure, this order, this hierarchy, all that. But now, I'm very sad to say that you see people on the left and the right, libertarians do this too, but certainly on the left, saying straight up that shame is good and necessary. They're talking about repression. They don't use that term, but they use shame. I've heard many people say this recently. Shame is good. We need to shame people. And I'm saying it may work in the short term, but according to Freud, and so far he's been proven right in many, many cases, they're going to come back, the people who are shamed, and they're going to come back probably as something worse, something that you really don't want.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that shame, like, I don't think you'll ever have a society with no shame. And I do think that perhaps you could argue that things that are genuinely destructive for society and I mean, you want to, like, to some degree in raising a child, if they do something that is not just anti-social in terms of like your own little value, but there's got to be some degree of shame of like, hey, we don't hit people or something, like, you know what I mean? Like, which I do think, like, shaming, I guess, acts of aggression or something like that, I would kind of be okay with. But I think certainly when you shame, I mean, I just think, yes, that is kind of the reactionary way that things work, and that even that may have some blowback, but it might be necessary. Yeah. But the idea of just shaming somebody, especially who's just like being themselves,
right?
Shaming somebody for just expressing their own individuality or something like that, when it's really unnecessary for society to do this. Because, like, I'm saying, like, I agree with what you're saying, but it's like, I don't want to go live in mud huts. Like, I do want to live in society. Yeah. So I want to find a way to, like, have a civilization and also not unnecessarily shame people. But I do think on the left, where they fight shaming is with the anti-slut shaming culture. Yeah. But where there's got to be some type of balance between, it's like, okay, you can have that. You can say, look, you shouldn't shame a woman for being sexually promiscuous, and certainly in a conservative sense that has been done for a long time in civilization. But then I don't know if you can say, well, I'm going to go do 10 shots and a keg stand at the party, and if somebody grabs my ass, it's you know what I mean, like a federal case. Right. It's like you kind of have to have one or the other.
Oh, they're very confused and full of contradictions. Yeah. No doubt about that, because they haven't thought through this, because they've never been on my show.
Yes, probably right. You have to have each one of them on.
So that's what I'm working on. So that, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I find that comedians are my heroes, right? And my greatest inspirations. I think I've said this to you, but like Richard Pryor in particular, Carlin, Lenny Bruce, many, many comedians, Dave Chappelle, and others really have inspired me more than any theorist, academic, I can think of, because that's what they do, right? They refuse to be shamed.
Right.
That's it. You can't be a comic if you're ashamed.
No, absolutely not.
That's the whole point.
That's the prereq.
That's the whole thing, right? They're saying things that are shameful. That's what you do. You say things that are shameful. That's why it's funny.
Yeah.
Right. That's
what. But it's something that's shameful, but with a hint of like truth, or a hint of like, you bring something that we all kind of have that we're not talking about. Right. That's under the surface.
Yeah, you're exposing the hypocrisy of it.
Right.
Right. That you're basically, this is your bit, right? Oh, we all think and have all said, grab them by their pussy.
Yeah.
That was your whole point in that bit.
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
that's right. And far worse.
Yeah. So you're developing a new special?
Yeah, that's what I've been working on. I've been kind of, going on the road and doing spots in the city. I mean, once that one's over, you kind of say goodbye.
How does that work? I've always wondered about that. How do you write an hour of comedy? That's, first of all, a lot of writing.
Yeah, it is.
And do you actually write? Are you?
No, I don't. I mean, some people do.
Like on a computer, you're sitting there tapping out lines.
No,
and bits
I never do that.
Okay.
I just kind of I work all off.
It's all in your head.
Yeah, it's all in my head. I mean, before I put the hour together, I would sit down and kind of be like this bit. Now, where do I want the order?
Like
where do I want to
list.
structure? Yeah, that kind of thing. But even besides the hour, that's the only time I've really ever done that. But no, for me, I write a lot of topical jokes. I just like joking about things that come up kind of in the news or some new thing, and I'll do that. But a lot of those things don't have a very long shelf life. So if you write about something that happened this week, you write a joke about Oprah's speech at the Oscars.
Right.
It's well, I'm probably not going to be doing that on my special. But kind of as you're doing that, I'll come up with a few things that are oh, well, this one can stay, this one can stay, and then kind of I mean, I write about the last special I did was all about the 2016 election. The first half hour of it was all about Hillary Trump and the Trump moment and all that. But it just seems like I just had a lot to say about that.
So what's the process? So for me nowadays, I read Twitter and I listen to podcasts and I read books sometimes and I read articles and I do my research for my book. And in the process of doing all that, I'll just, when I note something, I see something that's of particular interest to me that I think is very significant, that I'll sort of note it to myself, or I'll see someone, listen to someone who I think might be a good podcast guest. Right. I'll write them down on the list and then I'll just sort of assemble this. This is constant. I'm constantly doing this. I'll even do it when I'm sleeping sometimes. Constant process of accumulation. I'm just collecting like shells on the beach, right? And then finally you have a bag big enough that you have an hour of comedy, or you have a podcast, or you have a book, or whatever. Yeah. Is that more or less what you do?
It's somewhat similar to that. I mean, it's things will kind of come to me just in the course of whether it's reading articles or watching cable news or stuff like this. Something comes to me about the absurdity of this, and it's oh, okay, there's a nugget there. And then usually I work it out on stage. And then weirdly, what happens a lot is that you get on stage and things come to you. You'll be kind of in the moment on stage, and it's just something you get in this kind of zone of I'm being funny now for a group of people. You get a few laughs. It kind of feeds this thing. And a lot of times, a lot of things that I have, sometimes not necessarily the idea, but the delivery of it or the line of it, that'll just come to me on stage. And then I kind of on stage, you make a mental note, oh, okay, got it there.
And it's all mental notes. You don't write anything
Pretty
down.
much all mental
I have
notes.
To keep lists.
Now, I'll say before I did the hour, I did a little bit of kind of writing, just kind of bullet point, ordering the jokes. And then I would record myself doing it a few times. That was to get the hour together. But in terms of if I'm just on the road, if I'm going to Boston in March, or I'm going to LA in March, if I'm on the road just doing a set, I like to just be free flowing and just kind of I don't have any particular order. I think I'll probably end on this joke, but let me just do an hour and have some fun, mix it up with people. I like that freedom.
But you're not worried you're going to forget anything? See, that's my great worry. I'm going to forget that person or that thing or that article or that idea.
It happens all the time, but I'll take that as a, kind of, I've had a lot of sets where I'm oh, I want to make sure I do this. And then at the end of this, you get off stage, you're oh, didn't do that, but I'll trade that for not being tied to a specific order. I feel that just makes it kind of stale after a while. I like mixing it up and almost seeing if I can get out of this to that next thing.
It's impressive. It's interesting. I'm always curious how people work creatively. What the process is.
I made a lot of people because you tweeted out that clip of me on SE Cupp's show Unfiltered the other day.
Genius.
But I got
heroic,
thank you very
brilliant.
much. Thank you. I appreciate that. But the comment that a lot of people made to me was they were everyone else has notes in front of them. And I'm the only one just sitting there without him. But I don't like any of that. It's I don't like to go out on a show with oh, these are my talking points on this or that. It's well, I'm going to sit here and when the question comes to me, I'm going to tell you what my thoughts are on that. And that's always worked better for me.
Yeah, but you also had a huge arsenal.
Oh yeah.
Walking into that studio. So this was, I think the tweet, what I tweeted something if you had 45 seconds on national TV to make an argument to convince Americans to overthrow the entire foreign policy establishment, this is what you would do. And it's Dave Smith. You had 40. I counted it. It's 45 seconds. You did 45 seconds. And the question was about Yemen.
No, it was about Syria.
Oh, it was about Syria.
About
staying in Syria.
I pivoted to Yemen.
Correct. So she's basically making an interventionist argument about Syria, right? Saying we should go into Syria with boots on the ground, et cetera. And she said, and Dave, what do you think? And Dave, just 45 seconds, lays out pretty much the history of American foreign policy, the major points of it over the last 30 years, with an argument that binds all of those facts together with a passion that never loses, you never lose control. And you deliver it it's a bullseye. And it's like by the end of that 45 seconds, I'm thinking, how could you listen to that and not at least be skeptical about American foreign policy and the idea of regime change?
Well, thanks. I mean, I really appreciate that, but I'll tell you. I mean, for me, it's like and I mentioned this on your on the last time I did your podcast. But what brought me into this world was the Ron Paul Giuliani moment, and that just like it was like the issue that got me into this. It's the issue I care about the most. I've read a lot about it. I've talked to Scott Horton on the phone like once a week for an hour. I mean, you know, it's like so. It is a challenge because you're sitting there and there's like, you know, it's like you got this short window and I'm like, you want to, it's so easy to go off on a thing, but you're like, let me just hit these key points. And, but I was happy with how that one came out.
I don't do cable news anymore. I stopped doing it a while ago. I don't want to do it, even if they ask
me. It's so
me.
ridiculous.
Well, first of all, not many people who are under 50 watch it. And so it doesn't even help your career much. But,
yeah, that's true.
But I've never seen it have much effect. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I think unfortunately, you probably had not much effect.
No, I mean, the value of that thing is almost that the clip gets shared on the internet.
Yeah,
it's not even, I'm saying it's basically like just going a roundabout to do what we're doing now in a very short little time frame. It's really, it's utterly ridiculous. The whole thing about cable news, it's just like, you sit there and you're like, what is this clown show? Like, who is this for? It's for someone who's like wants to be completely uninformed but feel like they're a little bit informed. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's they sit there. It's like this whole thing where it's just like blue lights and red lights and news. Blah, blah, blah. Like,
it's dying too. It's dying. There will be no CNN in 10 or 20 years.
Yeah,
or MSNBC or any of those. It'll be gone.
I think you're absolutely right.
Because their audience is literally dying.
Yes,
right.
Yes, and it's all moving to online stuff like that, and that people can't literally. I mean, I'm talking about like I talk to a lot of these people who are like contributors, and this isn't true for all of them. Some of them are very smart, but there are so many people who you see on cable news who I'm talking about literally could not do your podcast.
Oh, God,
like
no.
They couldn't sit here and talk for that long. They'd be out of talking points within like 2 minutes. You'd be completely bored with them. Yeah. You'd poke a million holes in what they say, and they just wouldn't have enough to fill the time. Oh, yeah. They just don't have any thoughts. Yeah. Like it's
absurd. Yeah, it's reached levels where it's just absurd to watch these. When I watch CNN or MSNBC or Fox or any of them for 5 minutes, I'm just like, I cannot believe I'm seeing this. I cannot believe these so-called intelligent human beings, adults, are on television saying this. That's why we have podcasts, and that's why we're taking over, man.
Yeah.
No, I
agree.
YouTube and podcasts, we're taking over.
No, I completely agree with that.
Thank God. And good luck. I can't wait for your next special.
Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to put it together.
Yeah, I want to go see it. And thanks for doing this again.
Dude, thanks so much for having me. I love it. I love what you do, man. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I've enjoyed both times being on.
I love talking to you, Dave. I really do. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
This was the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To sign up for the Renegade University webinars, visit thaddeusrussell.com/courses. To support the show and become a member of the Unregistered community, go to unregisteredlisteners.com. Thanks for listening.